Welcome back to Give Up After 3, a critical analysis of BBC's Sherlock, where each week we watch one episode of the show in our endless pursuit to try and understand how things went so wrong that fans invented a secret final episode to justify why the show had been bad the whole time. My name is DC McNeil. I'm the author and editor-in-chief at Zero Indent. I'm joined once again, as always, by Darth. How you doing, Darth?
I'm doing fantastic. Looking forward to getting to this. I have double the notes that I had on the first one, and we recorded for 3 hours on the first one.
Yes, that we should put like a health warning on this, like halfway through, please stand up, stretch. You know what I mean? Like, you know, when you're on an airplane, they're like, you need to get up approximately every 4 hours, you know, to keep your blood circulating. We should get some kind of a disclaimer in here. Well, look, it's episode 2. We're going to be covering The Blind Banker today. This was directed by Euros Lin. It was written by Stephen Thompson. It originally aired the 1st of August, 2010. It opened to approximately 7.74 million UK viewers. Content disclaimer for this one. This episode contains topic of self-harm, suicide, and depression. And this one was adapted loosely on the adventure of the Dancing Men and the Valley of Fear. Before we get into the summary, Darth, tell me about your experience coming back to this. How did you feel at a very high level?
Coming back and actually, again, this whole thing is giving me opportunity to really like delve into looking and analyzing the episodes, which I've never done before. And you could really see the cracks starting to form with this episode, as you've been warning me about this whole time. And the strongest thing that I came away with was just the overall feel that they tried to go with. Like, this entire episode was based around like the feeling like it was the Orient, you know, like because it was based around all of this Chinese stuff, it makes the episode interesting in a way that kind of covers up for all of the mistakes. And there's like specific examples like going forward. But that was kind of the biggest thing. Was I wonder if it was just scrap all that and it's just normal London stuff, and would the mistakes have been more obvious? But the fact that it's all this, you know, Chinese mysticism kind of like hides it a little bit more than it otherwise would.
Interesting. I had not thought of that at all, so I think that's going to be a really interesting thread to kind of pull on as we go through. Look, I'll be honest, rewatching it this time, so this is normally the episode where I in my rewatches where I go, oh god, like as you said, I can start to feel it here. I got to about, I'll call it out when we get to it in our analysis, but I got to a particular point in this episode and I had to physically stand up from my couch and walk away. I was like, god damn it. So I'm really starting to feel it. I'm excited about next episode. I think that the ability to kind of look back on this first season as a real inciting point for this series is going to be fascinating. And then we can kind of vacillate into the more interesting challenges with the show. The most polite thing I can say about this episode is that it is very, very competent, and it is a mystery story that is solved, and our heroes solve it, and there is mortal jeopardy. And so at the very least, it is, you know, in my opinion, you know, probably like a middling Sherlock story as far as like the canon or you know, other examples. It doesn't hold a candle to things like House MD. You know, obviously it's not as, you know, interesting and slick as the original stories, but in my mind, like, this is a perfectly fine detective story in this mode of storytelling. And like you said, I think it's starting to find its voice a bit as far as like stylistically. There's a lot more of those kind of flashy edits and stuff that we'll start to see take prominence in season 2. Okay, well, I'll get us through the summary and then we can start to actually tackle the individual components of this episode. I apologize in advance. This summary is a bit all over the place, but I was trying to like make it into something straight up and down.
There's a lot to summarize in here too. It sounds pretty crazy.
I've tried to keep it as brief as possible. It's only a few paragraphs. We'll see how we go. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to be skimming over a lot, so don't worry. We'll get into the weeds. A mysterious message is painted around London. The first person to see it ends up dead. Sherlock Holmes is recruited by an old friend to investigate a break-in at a bank where strange symbols have been spray-painted on the office wall. Holmes deduces the message is intended for an employee who is found dead in his flat. The following day, a journalist is killed with the same message in paint nearby. Sherlock deduces that the man was murdered. John gets a job as a general practitioner, while Sherlock identifies a new death that he suspects is linked to the journalist's death. With the help of Scotland Yard, Sherlock visits the new victim, Brian Lucas, who appears to have shot himself. The same messages are once again near his body. Sherlock again insists the man was murdered, and the only way in or out is via the skylight on the 6th floor, so the killer must have been an incredible climber. After some needless side quests, John and Sherlock identify a connection to a local museum where the same symbols have been painted. An employee, Sue Lin, is connected to the messages and begins to decipher them before she is killed. Sherlock tricks John and his date to attend the circus where he suspects the killer resides, and all manage to escape with their lives after a complicated melee. Back at Baker Street, the gang works out that the symbols are threats from Jiju, taking revenge against a trio of smugglers caught stealing from an international smuggling ring. John and Sarah are taken by the killer, Jiju. Sherlock saves them in an exciting action sequence. John accidentally crossbows a man through the chest. The next day, John and Sherlock head to the bank, confirm their assumptions, collect their reward, and head off. In the tag of the episode, the head of the smuggling ring speaks to her benefactor, M, on the computer. M assures her that her actions won't be traced back to him as a sniper bullet fires and we cut to black, presumably killing the smuggler. So I skipped over a ton of stuff, but at a very high level, that's what we're talking about here. So let's just get stuck in because it's going to be a long one, I think. Okay, so let me set the scene here. At the National Antiques Museum, Chinese pottery expert Su Lin Yao demonstrates a tea ceremony to a group of visitors. Afterwards, as closing time approaches, her co-worker Andy, this kind of skinny, twinky guy, asks her out for a drink, but she turns him down and says he wouldn't like her if she got to know him, and she tells him to stop asking her out, so clearly he's done this before. That night, Su Lin is working late when she hears someone moving. She goes to investigate and finds a statue covered with a canvas. When she pulls the canvas sheet away, she stares in shock at what she sees underneath. This is our kind of like opening, I guess, like quote unquote crime, or sort of, that's the inciting hook here. Once again, I think this is a really strong opening. I like the idea of her seeing something horrifying that we don't get to participate in. It's also cool because then when we cut to Watson and Sherlock, we kind of wonder like, how are they going to get involved? Like, how is this related? It's just like good TV at this, in these opening kind of shots. Do you have any thoughts about this like tea ceremony here?
Yeah, and that's kind of the first thing to what I said before about how the mysticism of that culture just lends itself so much to kind of distracting, because it's not like anything she was saying was that interesting. And when you go back and really look at it, like there's a bunch of kids there who are somehow fascinated by tea pots that are 400 years old. No, like it does not track logically whatsoever.
It was 2010. They didn't have TikTok.
But even after that, the opening dialogue just had me fascinated. Like the opening dialogue while she's doing the ceremony, fine, that all kinds of tracks with the mysticism and everything. So that's fine because that's, like I said, the theme they were going for with the whole thing. But then the opening dialogue with her and her coworker Andy was so confusing once you actually like start breaking down the text. Number one, the fact that she is seemingly like off-put by him asking her out constantly, but then I laugh so much every time I look at the line again because she says, "Things are meant to be touched." And then she looks up at him with these big eyes, like she does the head turn, "Things are meant to be touched." And then she looks at him and I'm like,
my guy is picking up on correct signals here, like, to an extent, yeah.
So, like, I don't know if that... either that was poor writing and the entire intent was that she was never interested in him, or the intent was that this was purposefully signaling she was interested in him and she was trying to protect him by not getting involved. Now, we don't have any other hint as to that later on, so unfortunately it's just kind of up in the air, but it would have been a really nice thing that this was tied in. She really did have a crush on him. That was our hint, and she just will not let it play out.
We might find ourselves an answer in the paratext when we get to discussions of Sarah and gender. So that's a really interesting thought. Let's put a pin in that and we'll revisit it when we talk about Sarah, because I think I've tuned my brain into the Stephen Moffat wavelength, and I think I have a coherent answer to you as to why that scene plays out that way, but it kind of relies on some future context. Okay. So yeah, but it is interesting in that we, like Andy, are like, oh, like, but I thought, okay, well, that was weird. And so you either read that, I mean, it depends how you read that interaction. Either like yeah, that's off-putting, or we go, well, hang on, what is going on here? Like, what's the, what how does this relate to what's about to happen? And then you see this evening, the thing happened later, and it's like, well, maybe there's another reason that she's rebuffing his interest.
Yeah, but something else that was interesting was the fact that I think this entire opening sequence was only there to introduce the teapots. All of the dialogue was superfluous to the rest of the story. It was just to introduce that you pour stuff over the pot and it gets shiny. Like, they even blatantly like say that line twice. Like, she says it during her thing, and then when she's talking with Andy, she says it again. Look how much the thing shines. Like, it's just like the taxi thing in that first episode. They're giving you the hint right off the bat.
Yeah. They're like, hey, remember the shiny, because it's going to become important later.
Yeah.
The other thing that this does for me, though, and maybe I'm just biased in my reading of this because she's one of the last good characters in the show, but Sue Lin, like, is a really interesting and complex character that we get to learn a little bit about later when she's talking about her brother and all the things we'll get into later in the episode. And so for me, I think it's really strong characterization showing this deep care and kind of consideration for a complex tradition. I quite enjoy that aspect of it. I mean, obviously it is expositional to be like, hey, the pot, shiny pot, shiny, 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 shiny pot. Hey, later when you're looking at this pot, do you think it's shiny? Like, it's doing a bit of that, but I also just like, I think it's an interesting character. I mean, obviously there's some coding going on here with, East Oriental, kind of Western views of East Orientalism and mysticism. There's certainly some coding here, but I mean, for the most part, I think it's at least. It's a start of some good characterization that I'll talk about when we sort of get more of her. But yeah, I do tend to agree. I think it's very, it's self-serving in the way that it's giving us context for the mystery ahead.
Yeah. And then the last two things I had in this first beat was that, when the opening credits come up, I assume it stays this way, and I was just interested to note that both Martin and Benedict, they had equal billing. So I don't know if they were both like that unknown going into this, or they were both equally known going into it. But it was just an interesting point. Because
I think Martin Freeman is way more famous than Benedict Cumberbatch at that point.
Because this was prior to The Hobbit, though, and that's, like, as far as I know, his biggest well-known piece.
I mean, The Office, and then he's done so much stuff. He's
Well,
been in the industry
if
so
you're
long.
American, you've never ever tried to watch that show. I have tried. It is tough as an American to get into that version versus the Americanized version of The Office, which I very much loved. And it was
controversial opinions all round.
Yeah.
I think they're both fine.
I need to give it a bigger shot because I only got like a couple episodes in. And it was so weird to see the similarities between what they tried to like directly copy and then the humor that worked between cultures and the humor that did not work between cultures. It was just really interesting. But the last note that I have about that first beat was she's looking at the statue, she pulls the sheet off of it, screams, and then we cut to black. I want to talk about her reaction to the paint. I want to talk about that later, but the fact that it cuts to black, like you said, is very intriguing to the audience, but I think it would have been even better to see the paint.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think I agree with you. Because originally I would kind of have argued, maybe it's cool to not know what she saw. But there's no reason why, because like we don't ever really get a chance to decode the paint for ourselves. So what's the harm in showing it? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't, yeah.
And it does hit completely.
It
hits completely differently the way they introduce it. They may have intended to show it initially, and it got cut. It could be a really easy shot to cut out of there, but because if they showed it then, the paint would be synonymous with horror and possibly death. Because of how they showed it later, it's more synonymous with mystery than it is with horror. So it's a completely different tone with the way they introduced it. So they could have changed their minds at some point.
Interesting. Okay, that's a good thought. I also wonder to what extent the paint thing, they might have worked that out as they were shooting as well, like the actual style of that, what that kind of paint is going to look like. I wonder how much that kind of came together in the editing bay to an extent where they kind of went, we need to have all these symbols make sense. And I'd be curious if someone has sat down and looked at all of the paint symbols and actually worked out if it is a real cipher or not. I think that'd be a curious exercise. Anything else on that interstitial prologue?
Yeah, let's get on to minute number 5 now.
Okay, so I really like this scene, by the way. Watson struggles to buy groceries at the store while Sherlock battles a robed swordsman at home. When John finally does come home, he complains that he had a row with the machine and that Sherlock has not moved all day. John then asks Sherlock for money, and Sherlock explains they need to go to the bank. I
Was
think
that
him
you
having
this morning?
trouble-
Was that you standing in the self checkout, just sitting there seething?
It was. It was a similar vibe. Me and Watson are on the same wavelength there. I thought that was very, very funny. Him having trouble with the self-checkout machine is very good. I'll be honest, Sherlock's little thing with the assassin is dumb and bad, and I wish they just cut that. It doesn't do anything for us. It's ridiculous. I hate it.
Yeah, agreed. But the interesting thing was when you go back and really look at John's scene, that the same thing is true for that, because it is so easy to get caught up in the, it was funny, it was well acted, thus it was entertaining. But it doesn't set out to do what they were trying to do. The point of that scene was to show that John was broke. Instead, it makes him look incompetent because he can't get the machine to take his card. The card doesn't say no funds available. It says something completely different, so, and then he comes back and he's angry and he says, I need a job, I need money. Sherlock gives him his card. So the entire thing should have been handled differently to really get across the point of the scene, which was that Watson was broke. Not that Watson was an incompetent shopper who can't handle technology, which is what it turned into.
Which is what it ends up being. I think that's like a real, well, how do we make this fun type. Okay, but I suppose the other thing it is doing is it's putting Sherlock's credit card in his wallet, which is important later.
Yeah.
But yeah, certainly I see what you mean. It does sort of diminish from, but I mean, there's something charming and bumbling about Watson. That I think.
There is. That's the problem, is that I love how it was acted and I love how the comedy was written, but structurally those things shouldn't outweigh the overall purpose of having that scene. I've got the same argument with a ton of Thor's interactions with the Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, yes, he's funny, he acts it well, but he shouldn't be funny in those instances,
Yeah, the challenge that we've got here, and this is something we'll be talking about extensively, particularly next season, is the conflict between the formal requirements and the formal apparatus, and then the actual stylistic apparatus. So what you're saying is exactly right. This scene is supposed to demonstrate narratively that Watson needs money. It's why he goes to get a second job. It's why he meets this girl. It becomes like a point of kind of inciting narrative incident, right? It becomes the start of a B plot in a certain sense. And so formally, this scene has to show us the reason he needs to go and get a job, which is, he's broke. Stylistically, what it's trying to do is show us that he, is kind of an old school guy and he's a bit bumbling when it comes to technology, and technology is like not his forte, which comes up again in later seasons. And so when you have those two competing forces, because the text doesn't resolve them, you're left with a challenge where the scene structurally is pretending it did one thing, but when you watch it, it does something else. And the challenge that this show will have and will continue to have is that it will continue to pretend that the formal structure of a particular scene and where it sits within the general structural apparatus of an episode, it will continue to suggest one thing happened formally while another thing actually happened stylistically. And this becomes a real challenge in Moffat's writing writ large, and we'll talk a little bit about that today, and probably more so season 2, episode 1. But really good call out. I think we need to keep an eye out for more of this because it's going to become really prevalent.
And again, just to reiterate, I fully agree about the fight. I wrote down the fight with Sherlock myself, that it does not really make sense. At least I don't think it should make sense for his character, for him to be a successful brawler. The only way that I've ever really liked that rendition of Holmes is in the stuff they did with Robert Downey Jr.'s character, where he is interpreting data so quickly that he can see blows coming and he could see the enemy's weaknesses and all this kind of stuff. But like, you have to do like slow motion and specific stuff for that, because otherwise it just comes across differently. And Sherlock just does not seem like he should be the brawny character that could win the battles. That should be the military man who's his cohort.
The challenge that you've also got with, I mean, so I was thinking for a cheeky Patreon bonus, we might watch some other interpretations of Sherlock, but that one in particular I like, because the other thing you've got is Robert Downey Jr. selling it, because he does a lot of boxing and Krav Maga and Chinese boxing and stuff. So when he's doing those scenes, it's him doing it, and it sells it really well. Whereas Benedict Cumberbatch is just a guy faffing about, swinging a sword and doing a we're doing a fight. Oopsie daisy, I've done a fight. Like, it has this lack of gravity. Whereas I think when you get RDJ doing that, who does this stuff and is trained in it, he really sells it more, which I think is the other challenge. Sherlock being an adequate combatant is something. Steven does this a lot, and I don't understand why, which is like all of his male leads who are pacifists for the most part all seem to have this super secret ability to know kung fu, and they just choose not to use it. This is something that happens with the Doctor when it's Peter Capaldi as well, where he's like, yeah, well, I could bloody take you down, but I choose not to. I'm gonna fence you with a spoon. Like, he's got all this amazing fighting prowess, and he just chooses, he's above all that.
I always thought that was just like complete bollocks as far as the Doctor goes, because you never see him physically do anything.
It's an important characterization for Steve in his male leads, because they need to be... We'll talk about... this is not the right juncture, because we need to get into some other stuff first, but there is a version of masculinity that his characters perform that requires that they both be socially isolated and have this, like, I'm smarter than you general attitude, and also be more physically capable than the jock archetype that they would typically be up against, because they need to be able to always have moral superiority as well as intellectual superiority. And the moral superiority often is, if I wanted to fist fight you, I could and win. I choose not to. I instead choose to engage you with my words. And that is kind of presented as morally superior to these jocks who want to do a fisticuffs kind of thing. And so you'll start to see more of that as the story goes on, where Sherlock will be quite judgmental of guns until he needs to use one, and then he's a crack shot. That sort of thing. It becomes a real complex at the heart of a lot of Moffat's kind of leading males and their particular performative version of masculinity. But yeah.
I wonder if you could also just say that that's an issue of the self-esteem of the writer, of that he doesn't believe that the lead can lead purely on intellect alone, and he has to have that brawn, or else the audience will not respect him. They'll respect the antagonist because the antagonist has the brawn. So from his point of view, he has to make the lead have both the intellect and the brawn, even though that should not be the case, because that's one of the things I love about the Doctor so much, is that he solves every problem purely through his intellect, or at least that's what he's supposed to do.
Yeah, until Steven gets his grubby little hands on him. That's a curious thought. I think what we should do is, as we go through, keep an eye out for moments where Sherlock is particularly physical, and they will be played for either, I'm guessing, I can't recall exactly, either pure comedy, or they are trying to communicate something that we otherwise don't need to know about him. And it's easily, it's like you say, it's either to communicate like, hey, I can beat the bullies, and, some insecurity there about intelligence getting it done. Or I think possibly more likely, the show needs to be exciting to watch, and a really good default for that is like some kind of action sequence. Weirdly enough, the action sequence that we get at the end of this episode works quite well, because he kind of uses his wits to kind of outmaneuver them, at least initially. And then when it comes to the physical stuff, he gets beaten immediately. So this isn't necessarily an issue yet. I don't know.
I mean, something you just said, it just rings so true as to like why they have this sword fight in there at all, because it does not lend anything to the overall story. And it's like, as soon as Watson asks for some kind of explanation as to what Sherlock's been doing, he just brushes it off, which I'll come back to later, because it's really interesting. This happens multiple times. And I don't know if they were doing this on purpose, but look at the multiple times that Sherlock is in a fight and chooses to hide it from Watson. And I don't know what they were trying. I don't know if they were making that part of his personality, or if it was him trying to protect him or what, but it happens so consistently. It's like a character trait.
It felt like it was. I suspect it might have been something they meant to pay off later and then just like forgot about. There's a lot of that in this where it's like,
Yeah.
here's a cool idea that might be going somewhere, and then they just like forget they started doing it. Yeah, it is interesting. Okay, well let's keep that in mind, because I want, when we get to that fight sequence at the end, I think all of these things might come together, like the kind of the way that gender is presented and performed, and then I think the physical violence here might all come together for us nicely. So at the bank, Sebastian Wilkes, an old university acquaintance of Sherlock, asks for help. As they exchange greetings, Sherlock deduces out of nowhere that Sebastian has made 2 trips around the world in the past month. He pretends to have learned this from Sebastian's secretary for some reason, but later confides to John that he figured it out from the fact that Sebastian's watch was brand new and was 2 days behind, apparently indicating he had crossed the international date line twice but had not altered the watch. Okay, do you have any notes on this before I just... before I really rip into this deduction?
This was, in my opinion, a good example of comedy done well, of when Sherlock is skipping ahead slightly, but when he's bumping up and down, trying to figure out what columns are in the way, trying to figure out which office seat was able to actually see into Van Koon's office. Like, that to me was the way that you do comedy and have it actually fit the scene and kind of like fit the character, because Sherlock doesn't care what people think about him. He looks like an idiot, but he doesn't care. He's got a crime to solve. All this kind of stuff. The watch thing was quite silly after I stopped and really thought about it.
It's beyond silly, Darth.
But then really the last thing I had, like, in this, I didn't have too much in this entire beat sequence that you had mapped out, except for feeling like throughout all of this that John was just purely turning into a plot device who was kind of like only there so that Sherlock would have an excuse to verbally explain stuff to the audience. That it just seemed more and more obvious that like that's why John was with him.
Something I find interesting is that you'll often have a bunch of notes about a scene that I just completely breeze past.
And then vice versa.
These 3 beats, I'm like, I have so much to talk about. It's interesting. It's interesting what we latch on to. So I wanted to call this out in particular because this is our first proper, complete nonsense deduction. We don't get to see the dates on Wilkes' watch. We don't get to see the watch in detail. We don't get to see the time. We don't know what today's date is. So... in my opinion, this is kind of the beginning of the end of the show caring about the audience's opinion. I talked about this a bit last episode. I'm curious to see how this evolves. But one of the things I want to call attention to is that I think it's okay for Sherlock to be this like super awesome genius who has access to information we don't. The problem is it has to be entertaining to watch, and we need to feel like we're being brought along the journey. And so often in moments like this, his dismissal of Watson, and by proxy the audience, makes it really frustrating to be on his side with this stuff, because like typically in the stories, right, Watson's a point of view character, and so Holmes will often explain to him, hey, this is how I did this thing, and that's how we as the audience get to understand what's happening. I don't know why Sherlock lies about how he understood this deduction to Sebastian, why he tells John the truth, and why it never comes up again. Like, this is just Sherlock being clever for clever's sake. Like, this doesn't go anywhere.
I mean, John blatantly says that, like, you did that just to piss him off or something like that. But it's like, if he didn't know that you were lying, then it wouldn't have made him angry. So the entire reasoning for hiding it from him didn't make sense in the first place.
And it's not like it gets revealed to him at any point in the script. Sebastian doesn't have a moment later where he's like, oh, you fuck it, I talked to my secretary and you lied to me and this is a point of friction. Yeah. This is just never addressed.
But one interesting thing about what you were just saying with how, Sherlock is supposed to be this ultra, smart guy, and that's fine. But the another huge problem is that he's not just super intelligent, he's super observant in a way that the audience can't be. And so, like, if you actually look at the scene, you see his eyes track to the watch, so the audience knows when that happened. We saw him observe the watch, but the distance that he was away, he would not be able to read the numbers as small as they were with the watch being upside down that's the biggest problem, because you see the same thing later with the hand soap. He's like 10 feet away, but he could read this super tiny print on the bottle. So it's not just that he's super intelligent, it's that his powers of observation are literally like Superman. And so we like we could see it. We could, even if we could see the watch, we wouldn't be able to read it without his supervision.
Yes, and the challenge the show has is they have a device that would let us see this stuff, where they could use the superimposed VFX to show that stuff. But like, and it's like, as you're saying, you're right. The problem is later on they go, we'll just use that for everything. That'll solve all our problems. And so instead of interrogating like, how do we better write these scenes so that it seems feasible, they're just like, nah, we'll just throw up some VFX and then it'll be fine. To the point where it becomes kind of farcical. I mean, yeah, it's not just that we can't read the watch; it's that we don't have a reference for the date. Like, there's a bunch of like, it's the whole thing. But that's where it starts as a problem. Is he looks at it in a way that we never have the opportunity to.
And that which, as you wrote down, that the watch didn't come out until like February or something like that. So that's another reason that he knew. How are we gonna Google the random stuff and see what date it was released? I mean,
that's like it's almost never how. In a short story, Sherlock solves anything. He's not like, yes, I had information you didn't. It's always like contextual stuff where he's like, you might have worked it out sooner if you'd known this other thing. But it's never like, I've solved it. It was this thing that you didn't know about. Like, it's already starting this trend of Sherlock inventing information to solve a problem. And it's not sort of, so I guess by contrast, the first solve that we see in Elementary is, I encourage everyone to Google it. I'm sure the scene is out there for free. Is he's basically, they're in this locked house, and there's been a murder. And they're trying to work out where the body is, and they can't find it. And this is a really wealthy family. The way that he kind of works out this problem is he's walking sort of in this bedroom, and you can see him sort of balancing and paying attention to the balance of the floor. And he picks up a marble, and he puts it on the floorboards, and it rolls down toward a wall. And as it does, he pushes a button and it opens a safe to an escape room. A panic room. And the thing that you learn there is that panic rooms are incredibly heavy and they will often create slants in floors around them. That's like a thing that you couldn't have guessed because you're not Sherlock, but the second he points that out, it's actually a thing you can use in real life. And if you had known about that, you might have been like, rich, wealthy person, he seems to be checking the floor, maybe there's a panic room here. And so it becomes information you can use in real life, which is like obvious information too. Panic rooms are really heavy. They're fully enforced metal. That first solve, you can actually get there before him with enough contextual information because the wall looks kind of different. You can tell he's doing the floor thing. It communicates just enough for you as the audience that when he solves it, you go, aha, of course, if only I had thought of that. Whereas with this one, you don't get to see, like I said, you don't get to see the watch. We don't know the date or time. We don't know when the watch came out. It's just complete fiction. Makes me so mad. Okay, we need to keep moving on because I've got so much to talk about in these scenes. So Sebastian explains that someone broke into the former chairman's empty office the night before and sprayed an apparently meaningless set of symbols on a wall across the head of the chairman's portrait. Which also, by the way, very interesting that the chairman has a portrait of himself in his office. Very self-involved.
And that he's dead, apparently, which doesn't play into this whatsoever.
Doesn't come into it at all.
Yeah.
It's just an unrelated bit of... It's weird.
See, I think they had to do that because otherwise the entire mystery would have been directed at him. So it had to be someone's office who no longer worked there. But then if...
Yeah, but just like why just make it a different painting then? Make it like a landscape painting.
Yeah, but I think the symbolism of it over the eyes was supposed to be very, at least visually appealing to the audience. Because I definitely thought that was meaning. There was like, don't look, don't see, or something like that. So I think they had to have that painting there, or some person's painting, but... it was just a weird decision to make the owner of the office be dead and then never explain if that was relevant to the mystery whatsoever.
Sebastian explains that the building was sealed and the CCTV shows that the vandal did the deed within a 60-second period between 11:33 and 11:34 p.m. He offers to pay Sherlock to find the hole in their security. Sherlock turns down the money, but John quickly accepts. John turning down the money is cool. Arguably I'm going to say arguably because I don't know to what extent it sticks the landing. Arguably it reinforces John's money problem and also illuminates something about Sherlock that is curious. In this version in this version, Sherlock never seems strapped for cash at any point. I think the problem this creates is, well, not the problem, but a thing that it means you lose is that there is rarely external reasons for Sherlock to take a case that isn't kind of based on his intrinsic character motivation. Some really obvious examples here is like in other kind of detective fiction. The one that I singled out in my research was, say, the Dresden Files. You've got your personal investigator or your PI who are always constantly broke. They're always looking for the next job. And it means that periodically they might have to compromise their morals for a case, right? To do something they know they shouldn't, which can create some interesting friction in the story. This is like how Sherlock ends up taking the original Irene Adler case in the Sherlock Holmes short stories. And so in having him kind of never need or be interested in money, you lose this interesting challenge to his moral character where he sometimes would have to take a case because he needs cash, knowing that it might be the wrong thing to do. You just lose an extra, kind of dimension to the character, I think, in making him not interested or not need cash. It's just my thought there. I think it's just a missed opportunity for some really interesting work here, and some interesting conflicts they could have levied later. Sherlock deduces that Eddie Van Koon from the Hong Kong division has a line of sight view to the symbols on the office. As Sherlock leaves with John, he explains the graffiti was a message to someone, and Van Koon was the only one who could see the room where the message was left. Since he trades with China, he probably works at night, and the message was intended for someone who started their work at midnight. Like you said before, the line of sight thing, it's funny. I like it. It's also just regular detective work, too. To kind of sort of, like, this is something that anyone could do, which is work out what the line of sight is to that particular view.
Now, one plus to them is they went on and gave us all of those clues right when the guys entered the building, because you saw Sherlock observe what floor they were on, all of the key codes that the cards that people had to swipe, and all of this different stuff. So I don't know if it was enough for us to make any kind of deduction, but even seeing like the hours that people were trading, and I think you even saw the Hong Kong label at some point.
Yeah, we get all the data we need.
Yeah. One interesting thing that just popped in my head when you were talking, though, was about the security cameras. And this actually ties into the gun later on. And it's a breakdown of how much the showrunners are actually like researching the stuff that they have in the story. And like as one of the things we sell at my job is security cameras. And for a business that wealthy, having a camera only record one frame every 60 seconds, no. It's not like the cheapest ones. The cheapest ones we have still record 15 frames a second, not one frame every 60 seconds.
One frame every minute. Jesus, yeah.
Like it does.
That'd be so useless.
Yeah, and then the guy would have to know that it was every minute in order to get out of there without being seen, unless it was a complete fluke that he wasn't caught by the camera. Like, nothing about how they pitched the camera thing actually makes sense once you break it down, and the same exact thing applies later when they start talking about guns in the tunnel. And I wonder if it applies to some more stuff I haven't even picked up on. But it's like when they introduce something to make it an interesting plot point, and then it just doesn't track logically.
Yeah, so there's a challenge we have here, which is like, I think it's okay to bend the rules sometimes in fiction to get a scene to work, where not everything has to make exact sense. Like, I think this is where we get into the challenge of like, how do you correctly, in good faith, critique a text without becoming CinemaSins, where you're just looking for like logical, like loopholes. To your point, the biggest challenge this show faces is when a loophole is created, it often means that there is like, not necessarily that like things don't logically make sense, but rather things emotionally lose their impact when they need to have it. Like the gun in the tunnel thing, we'll talk about in that scene maybe, but I mean, that works for me because it's Sherlock. Either he's right or he's just bluffing, but it causes her to hesitate to give him long enough to do his maneuver. But yeah, the security camera thing, it's like, I don't know anything about security cameras, but that just seems like you could have written a way around that.
Yeah, even if it were just the camera was broken or something, but the biggest, like, I love CinemaSins just for the hilarity of it sometimes, but that's not necessarily, like, I don't want to go that direction where you're just trying to criticize everything. But the biggest sin to me is when the writers don't put adequate research into something. If they're like, I'm going to introduce an old, like, 87 Ford, and then you're not going to look at what engine was in the 87 Ford. Like, if you're going to introduce...
Especially in a detective story, right?
Yeah.
Where it's all about the details.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a big part of writing writing fiction in particular is like, you don't have to know more about a topic than the people who are experts in it, but you need to know enough to be convincing. And this just seems like an obvious, like it's written around this, like he disabled the cameras. Every detective story does that. He stuck in it. He turned the cameras off. Easy. He paid somebody off to disable them. It's easy. It's done. You could have even worked that in with the receptionist.
Yeah.
But she's somehow now implicated where, she took a bribe on the side to disable the cameras because she was, upset with Sebastian about, or upset with Van Koon about the breaking up of their relationship. Like, you have there's ways you can do this that add more stuff to the story that is interesting texture. Instead, it's just dumb.
Yeah. Especially with the villain being like a national mercenary. I mean, like, he would theoretically have the skill set to disable the cameras. And even if they did just a really short scene of when he broke in, he disabled the cameras. So there's a lot of ways that they could have
just change the line of dialogue. You just change the line of dialogue. It's easy. Anyway, so we do get this scene, which I think is, speaking of cinema sins, we get this scene of Sherlock opening the office window and stepping outside to check for signs of entry. I've worked a lot of corporate jobs, and every job that I've worked since I ran a kitchen has been a corporate job at a desk. I've never worked in a high-rise office building where you can open windows.
I was about
to say. For obvious reasons.
Yeah. I've never even been in one, and I know that the windows are locked.
They're not locked. They just don't open. Like, it's not that they're locked. They don't. There's no latches. Like, they are just.
Well, the difference in that one would probably be that it literally had a balcony for them to go out on.
Yeah, true.
But aside from that, it still would almost definitely be locked. Aside from whoever the owner of that private suite was, which it was the owner of the bank. So that's probably the guy that's like, if I want a window balcony, I'm getting a window balcony.
Yeah, I'm griping, but I just thought it stuck out to me as weird because I was like thinking about my office and I'm like, that's not how it works.
And again, it's something that's so easily solved with just like, hey, who has the key? Like,
it's also possible that, but again, this is where I'm like, there's so many opportunities to make a really interesting like piece of friction here. Like, maybe again, it's the receptionist and she's disabled the cameras and she's unlocked the thing because she's pissed off at Van Koon about their relationship ending. Like, I just think there's a way that you can tie all this stuff together that isn't super naff or on the nose. And they just miss that opportunity more than they hit it, I guess.
Or even to tie everything together even better is to have maybe even show that the lock was picked, and they show that on purpose, because then they show the same thing later with Su Lin, and then you could have, like, that's part of the mercenary's toolkit, is he can pick a lock. So then the only question that Sherlock is stuck with was, how did the guy get up this 45 stories to pick the lock in the first place? Did he parachute in? Like, there's all these different options that could have happened, but how did it happen?
I think the problem with that is that the coolest mystery, the mystery in like in italics here is like, but all of the rooms were locked. How did the killer get in? And so the second you talk about picking locks, it's like, well, the mystery is not interesting anymore because it doesn't sound cool.
Yeah. The problem is, I think
you're not wrong.
That probably goes out the window, but as soon as Sherlock opens the door and looks out the window, and then you're like, aha, that's how he got in.
How dare you? How dare you introduce a pun like that on this program, Dale?
If it's accidental, it's okay.
You can't pause to be like, what about that? It's not an accident, then. Fucking jimming the camera over here. Okay, Sherlock and John find Van Koon dead in his flat, shot in the head by a Sig Sauer P226 pistol lying by his side. Is that how you say that, Mr. America?
I just call it a gun. I don't need to know what it's called. I just need to know the sound it makes when it kills a man.
Yeah. Doesn't matter what kind of gun it is, they'll kill people the same. With the police in tow, Sherlock determines Van Koon has just returned from a 3-day holiday recently. Sherlock then identifies a black paper lotus flower in Van Koon's mouth and argues that Van Koon did not kill himself as he is left-handed. The gunshot wound is on the right side of his head. He explains that Van Koon had been threatened, the spray-painted message from the bank is proof of this, and was waiting for the killer. He fired a shot at the killer when he came in, but the bullet missed and sailed out the open window in the most insane coincidence I've ever heard. Sherlock then rudely tells Dimmock to check that the bullet was not from the gun that Van Koon owned. Now, I want to talk about some stuff, and then we need to talk about the red hot core deduction in this scene that is textually incorrect. Not in a CinemaSins kind of way, but in a way that like the text has proved is an incorrect assumption. What do you think about this scene before I get into that? Like, with, kind of coming in here, having a look. What's your take on this one?
I will say that finding the lotus in the dude's mouth, I never interpreted that correctly because I could not tell what it was. I swore I would have bet a lot of money that it was a razor blade, because for whatever reason, people keep razor blades underneath their tongue to use in fights, and that's like a gang thing or something. I don't know how American that is. I don't know how, but anyway,
Sounds very American.
yeah. But I never understood how they kept a razor under their tongue without cutting themselves to death. But anyway, apparently that's a thing for a long time. And when he pulls it out, it does not look like the same kind of flower we see later on, because obviously it was in a dude's mouth. But but still.
Darth the gang razor blade over here. Okay, all right,
But
interesting.
combined with Sherlock saying he had been threatened, and then he pulls out what looked to me like a razor blade, because that's what you would use to protect yourself, because it's something that the enemy can't see coming.
Interesting.
Yeah, but anyway, that wasn't at all what happened.
No, I've seen this so many times that I just know it's a Black Lotus. I'm not sure to what extent.
Gotcha.
Like, I'm just inoculated from that.
I really like the deduction of the right hand versus left hand thing, because it's so practical. It does not make sense for like what you talk about with the audience being able to see it beforehand, to be able to make that deduction beforehand. But just like the marble thing, like now that I've seen all of his descriptions, I'm like, I can tell if someone's left or right-handed just from walking around their house now, because he's shown me an example of what you would look for.
Okay, that part of it I do like. I do like the identifying he's left-handed from the apartment. That is like a practical thing that you can do. I was thinking about this when I was rereading my notes last night, and I was looking at my like table my coffee table where I sit and watch TV, and I was like, oh, it's super obvious that I'm right-handed from where everything is usually placed. Like, you could come in and tell that pretty quickly. But yeah, no, that part of it I think is cool. I also like how clear and vivid the type of person this apartment belongs to is rendered by the styling of it.
Yeah.
Like, it is just like tasteless modern Vogue. There's a fridge full of champagne. Like, you can tell this is just like a soulless banker guy, from the pure furniture and the way he lived. We don't need to meet him to know that.
Yeah.
I think that works really well.
And I think he had like toothbrushes and no toothpaste and no comb, and like there's like the bathroom was super weird once you look at the stuff that's actually in there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can we talk about the gunshot wound problem? And wait, is there anything else that you want to talk about in the scene before I really just get stuck in?
I was trying to think if I had a problem with a gunshot wound, because I'd never really thought about it. Now I'm like, why did the assailant come around to his left temple? Or no, his right, whichever temple, instead of shooting him straight on, which is what would normally happen.
So, okay, well, there's that. But so Sherlock's deduction here is that Van Koon didn't kill himself because he's left-handed and the wound is on the right side of his head, and that's how it's been framed, right? Sherlock says, someone who's left-handed wouldn't be shooting with their right hand, would they? That'd be crazy. No one would ever do that. You know who is left-handed and shoots with their right hand?
You said it was John, right? He does that in the...
Yeah, John Watson. In the previous episode, he does that. He takes the shot with his right hand. It's a very common military practice to preserve your right hand, to learn to shoot with your other hand. So very often, people in the military will use, for their sidearm in particular, will use their offhand. It also makes it easier to draw if you have a rifle in your other hand. So if you've got a primary weapon in one hand, you can then draw it with your other hand and use that sidearm.
It's actually practical from a different point of view. Just as a American Guns little tidbit here, but if your primary hand is injured or whatever, a lot of like my serious gun friends, when they go practicing at the range, they will practice with both hands, because if your right hand's injured, you got to be able to shoot with your left hand, or the mugger will get you.
America's so fascinating, because I do the same thing, but when I'm ironing my shirts, I'll try and use my left hand. just in case I need to keep just so it doesn't go completely uncoordinated. You know what I mean?
I don't think I can come back from that.
Because you want to keep the train just in case you need to use it or something. You know? What if I injure my right hand? I might need to use a mouse with my left. I need to keep that shit coordinated. Okay, so fucking America is such a dystopia, man. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that within the bounds of the text itself, the assumption that someone who is left-handed wouldn't use their right hand to shoot a gun is just like incorrect. It's an incorrect assumption. It's got the same kind of problem as the adultery solve in the previous episode. Remember with the ring where she's constantly taking it off and on? Where Sherlock as a show often stakes an entire episode's premise on an early deduction that Sherlock does that is either a guess or mostly an incorrect assumption. And I don't know how they keep they just keep doing it by accident. And it's weird. Like, his whole theory from here forth is that the person, because this is what lets him craft the theory, which is that this person is breaking in, and it's an assassin, right? That's the impetus for this whole thing, is him making this solve. That's how we end up getting the thrust of the episode. But it's like, and again, same with the adultery thing. It's what ends up leading him to make the solve about the phone, because he decides that she's very organized and would be sending them a signal because she's an adulterer who is highly organized. Like, so often these episodes stake an entire premise on an assumption that is either just a guess or just completely incorrect. And I just find it deeply interesting.
Another way that they could have had the same scene make a lot more sense would be that the person, the murderer, took the gun and fired the bullet through the window. Wait, no. That doesn't make sense. Because that was... So, my entire thing that I was just thinking is, how does Sherlock know that a bullet is missing? How does he know that that bullet wasn't the bullet inside the dude's head? But then... Because
there's gunpowder residue on the guy's hand, but he's pretty sure it's a different gun because it's the wrong hand. Because there's gunpowder residue on his other hand, on his left hand.
So we see Sherlock testing that when he gets in there?
No, we don't see that. That's the assumption that the scene is making.
Okay.
Yeah. I just think it's just, yeah. There's I don't know how to fix this. Like, I don't want to suggest a solve for this. I more want to call out that stylistically this moment exists for Sherlock to dunk on Dimmock and nothing else. It's him intellectually dunking on Dimmock and being like, I'm the top dog here. I am in charge here. You need to respect me. It's not necessarily about the mystery, right? It's about aesthetic and style here.
Well, I mean,
is the reason this solve is important.
With that same, why is he there? Why is Dimmock there? Why is Lestrade not there? Like, is it because that this scene is supposed to bring him down, and we're supposed to like Greg, so we don't want to bring him down? That's why they introduced a new inspector?
I think it's probably two things. I think it was, first of all, probably a scheduling conflict. These things almost always are with television. But also, when we talk about their next interaction with him at Scotland Yard later, I want to get into like why I think they added him in as a new character and what I think his function is. I don't get into it too much because we don't have enough context yet. But I think there is a good thematic reason that the show is going for. So, okay, with this information in tow, Sherlock and John encounter Sebastian while he's having dinner with some associates, and they tell him of Van Koon's death. He mentions the police have said it's a suicide and berates them for getting sidetracked. Later that night, journalist Brian Lucas is seen running down a busy street, constantly looking over his shoulder like he's being chased with a book under one arm. He scrambles into his apartment, locks all the doors behind him, and finds that his place has been searched. Panting, he turns and his mouth drops at what he sees, and we cut away. One thing I liked about the scene just before that is I like John's quote, which is, "I thought bankers were all supposed to be heartless bastards." I thought that was really funny. I like that they don't like bankers. That's good for me because bankers are the worst. I like it.
There was something really interesting that came out in that same conversation was when they took Sebastian. They took him to the bathroom to have their private talk. And in the course of that, Sebastian basically says, I don't care that a man died. I hired you to figure out how they broke into our building. Focus on that. And Sherlock looks at him kind of in shock and says Seb. He doesn't call him by his full name. He calls him by his pet name for him, and his reaction actually looked hurt that Seb was being that he was being dismissive. So what I wondered was that if Sherlock actually considered Sebastian to be a friend, and the fact that he was being so dismissive of Sherlock's expert opinion actually hurt Sherlock's feelings in that moment.
I think it's a really valid read. I mean, it's the first time we've seen Sherlock display. It's brief, but it is like some vulnerability there where he's like, "Oh, I thought this relationship was different than it is."
But you don't really see that in the very first instance where they're meeting, unless Sherlock not doing the deduction and saying, "Oh, your secretary told me." Maybe that was him sparing Seb's feelings or something like that.
I think that's how that's supposed to read. It's him being like, "I have a different relationship with this guy than I do with other people," kind of thing.
That could be.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to call out here is that we see Brian Lucas running back with a book, which is a really important detail that will become prevalent later. The next day, Andy is working at the museum when the director informs him that Sue Lin has resigned. Andy goes to her apartment in Chinatown and knocks on the door, but does not get an answer. He writes a note on the museum's stationery and places it in the mail slot. I don't have anything to write home about this. I think it's just moving the plot forward.
Well, you carry around the stationery from your job all the time, right? Just in case.
I don't. But maybe he looks like a big Dorcas. Maybe he's got a little pocket book.
That's
I don't know.
That seems to be like a really big trope in like mystery stuff, is that some character will have a scrap of paper from somewhere that has the logo of that business on the scrap of paper, and it's like, why are people always carrying around like logoed stuff with them? Like, it just
it's a real old school detective thing. It's because like in the 40s and 50s during like the noir boom, where a lot of those dime novels were set, you'd have like, branded matchbooks for different clubs, and you'd have, like if you've ever played LA Noire or kind of read Bradbury, that's a lot of the kind of stuff that you see in there, which is like, well, we need to work out what, what's the symbol mean, or what's this kind of thing. So I think it's just that rich tradition of detective stories. But yes, also, okay, we'll talk about when we talk about Dimmock maybe, but like Andy is an interesting kind of man. He's an interesting kind of portrayal of masculinity in this story, which I think is interesting.
It's like the fact that he actually goes to proactively try to see if she's okay.
Yeah.
But then he just gives up.
Yeah. So like he respects her boundaries enough to give up, but not enough that he goes in the first place. And there's an argument to be made that, like, well, he obviously cares about her as a person, but she's told him pretty categorically to piss off. And his other colleague is like, maybe she was getting some unwanted attention from you, obviously.
Yeah.
And his first instinct is better go check on her. Like, there's something happening there, I think, from a gender perspective that is curious.
I think his character would have been fine if they just did not have his superior say that line, because that line makes his intention, like, it's blatantly unwarranted at that point. But we had the little moment earlier where Sue Lin could have honestly been flirting with him. So that could have been true, except for this line from the superior. This line is saying that, no, she does not like you, and you probably drove her off. So now, like, our opinion of this character is just, it's dirt now.
Yeah, and it also reduces the the potential interest of them meeting again later, which they never do. But like that could have been interesting to see if we had a bit more ambiguity here. But also, I think this is classic. Like, we're not supposed to think that this guy is cool or desirable, so the text needs to confirm that he isn't. Like, we need to be told that he's kind of, making these unwarranted advances. The text has to explicitly state that can't be left ambiguous. Because we know that there's a type of masculinity that is attractive, which we'll see in a scene or two. And this version, this meekness is not it, is the kind of net of this. It's certainly positioning an opposition for the type of masculinity that Sherlock displays. You know, an alternative to the way that he and John behave, which is non-desirable, which is this kind of facile, kind of flaccid, like sort of nice guy in inverted commas.
Something else that was interesting in that same scene was when the superior walks up and she hands him a picture of two vases that he's supposed to whatever they authenticate or whatever, and then we find out later on that that's part of the whole smuggling ring, and I don't know if this was super obvious or not, that Sulin's entire purpose was there to authenticate the price of the stuff when it was smuggled into town.
Okay.
Like it was never like blatantly said, but she works at the museum that authenticates the Chinese national treasures, and then they have a price to put on them for auction. So she doesn't get to, like, the museum does not get to keep those vases. They were just authenticating them.
I think that's right. Yeah, I'm not super sure how that all is supposed to work. So yeah, but also I don't think that this story is particularly interested in the apparatus there.
Maybe not,
right?
But the fact that like they put that there on purpose. They showed us it was the same picture, you know, of the vases that we see later. So it just kind of had me wondering, is like, how exactly does she tie in? Because she made it sound like she was smuggling, but what if she wasn't smuggling? What if her entire purpose was something else? Although she didn't start working at the museum until after she ran away, so my entire argument just there was just completely moot. Everything I just said.
Like, bleep that out. X that out. But no, I mean, but these are the kind of questions that, like, it, you know, when we learn about her backstory, it does become really interesting to kind of think about the sort of person that ends up in this position and how she gets this job. And I think she becomes a really compelling character. So John applies for the position of locum at a local clinic and admits to the doctor, Dr. Sarah Sawyer, that he needs the money. She warns him that the job is mundane, but he insists it's fine. He returns to 221B and finds Sherlock contemplating the case and notices that Sherlock has opened John's computer, but this time not to check his email. Sherlock has got a news website up with an article about Brian Lucas, a freelance journalist who was shot and killed in his locked apartment by a killer who can apparently pass through walls. Sherlock decides the circumstances of the journalist's death seem identical to Van Koon and suspects a connection. I like seeing John get a normal job. It's fine. I think this is fun. Seeing him just do other stuff. I don't mind this B plot. It's fun.
It was interesting to me, like, this was the first time that it became like super obvious to me that I do not understand the British lingo. And going back and trying to really look at the text that they were saying, and I was like, what is a locum? What is he doing? And then later on, they've given me an ASBO. And I'm like, they gave you a what? Is that a medical thing? Like, do you need a cream to fix that? Like,
can I get you? Do you need to see somebody about that?
And so I kind of wonder, like, going forward, if I'm paying more attention to this, like, is the show getting more and more British, or does it start off even more British than I realized? And
no,
then
it gets more American.
It gets more American.
Yeah,
okay,
for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
it just starts really. This episode is very British.
Yeah, there was just so much dialogue that once I started paying attention, I always thought John was just like cursing in a language I didn't get, but then it turns out no, he's talking about like literal like doctor stuff, and then he's talking about the citation, some of the ASBO is a particular form of citation or something like that.
Yeah,
but
it's like getting written up for like a minor misdemeanor or something.
Yeah. But anyway, so one interesting thing when he's at that doctor's office and he's having his appointment with her, the way they did the interaction between the two of them and establishing, like, they don't start dating right there, but they start like minorly flirting, and it was done brilliantly. It was done very, very well. And what I really liked was the world building that they did with that doctor's office, because the phone is constantly ringing. You can hear people in the background. She never makes a move to try to pick up the phone. Anyone in an office situation would say, hold on, let me get the phone, and then they would do it. The fact that she doesn't indicates that this happens all the time. They're extremely overworked. They literally do not have time to answer the phone, thus why they're trying to hire in more people. Just the whole way they built up that world building there was just really good. And then going ahead to the computer bit, this has been a, I don't know if I should call it a joke, but it's a running theme that Sherlock is lazy. And I don't understand why they are building this theme in. But in the first episode, we had Sherlock call John in from halfway across London to hand him his phone, which was sitting on the desk. And then we had him at some other point in here. He said, "Can you bring me a pen?" I was in the other room. My pen was in the other room. And then in this scene, we have, "Why are you using my computer?" "Well, mine was in my bedroom." Like, they are literally building him up to be too lazy to get up and walk 20 feet. And I don't understand why that's a good character trait for him to have, aside from that it makes him look unique, I guess.
I have no idea what they're trying to do here, because it doesn't really like ever become a thing. Like, it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, like initially I think it was supposed to be that he didn't carry a phone because he thought like he was above the gadgets or something like that, but then it wasn't the case. He had a phone the whole time and he just liked using other people's phones to text. It's like they didn't really build up his backstory enough. And there's a difference in building up backstory that is portrayed to the audience and building up the backstory that the writers know what they have to have the character do. And that's what it feels like they did, is like they're like, let's just have Sherlock be quirky and he'll always use other people's stuff, but they didn't figure out why.
Yeah, or if that was going to have some kind of satisfying character arc or emotional payoff, right? And I think so. I suspect, tuning my brain into them off that wavelength, I suspect the idea here is that this is emblematic of his kind of lack of socialization and lack of investment in people. And I think it's supposed to be symbolic of that. And so later on in the final season, when that last episode forces him to confront some of his emotions, I suspect what we would have seen in a subsequent season, God forbid if they ever made more of it, is less of that stuff, and that maybe he learned a lesson about his own kind of interpersonal relationships and his interactions. That's my guess, if I had to guess at like why I think this is here. I think it's supposed to be seeded to then become something that gets paid off later, but it just never does.
I mean, it'd be interesting to hear a psychologist talk about this, because I could very easily see that it would be a way for him to punish his friends. Like, you weren't here, I'm going to teach you a lesson for not being here, I'm going to use your stuff. If you learn this lesson properly, you'll never leave my side and I'll never be alone. That would be an interesting way to interpret that the meaning behind him doing these things.
I suppose so. I mean, I guess it depends to what extent you sort of retext as psychoanalytical or not. I mean, I do sometimes. I think probably this more likely is, for the most part, let's assume that there is a thematic and narrative reason, and there's probably less about the psychopathy of this character, because I think having him say, "I'm a high-functioning sociopath, do your research," makes it pretty clear that like this show is not interested in the actual psychology of its characters necessarily, because that's nothing. Like, that's just not anything. Okay, let's talk about the sequence where they go to Scotland Yard, and then I want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff I've been hinting at, which is really dive into some of the gender of this show and masculinity. So, John and Sherlock go to Scotland Yard to make a request to see Lucas's apartment. As they're making their request to Dimmock confirms the bullet extracted from Van Kuren was not from his gun. In Lucas's apartment, Sherlock finds a black paper lotus lying on the floor, identical to the one he found in Van Kuren's mouth. Sherlock notices a skylight in the apartment and decides that both victims thought they were safe by locking themselves in, as they're impossible to reach. Sherlock deduces the killer broke into Lucas's apartment through the skylight. This seems to indicate that the shooter is a human fly, which is a term that I guess exists. I was like, what? Is that? Okay. In that he scaled a 6th-floor apartment building to kill Van Kuren and ran along the roof and onto the terrace to leave the message at the bank. So he's clearly quite acrobatic. I want to talk about this interaction with Dimmock and maybe try and unpack a bit about what you brought up before. Watching Sherlock interact with Dimmock is rough. There's a quote here which I've just pulled out, which is, Sherlock says to him, "This investigation might go quicker if you were to take my word as gospel." So I want to talk a little bit about the trying to think of the complex way to begin to talk about this. So I want to discuss the way that this show suggests people should perform masculinity, and to what extent it kind of dismisses that or agrees with it, and the kind of brand that it's portraying, which I think is very of its time. So now this will require us to talk about some stuff that you brought up last episode as well around the Big Bang Theory, for example. So I want to kind of set some ground rules here a little bit. So this episode is our first real interaction of Sherlock interacting with men and women in a combative mode, sort of like performing his masculinity as combat. He interacts with a woman who isn't Molly for the first time. So I want to kind of just delve into a bit about what all is going on here. So from Ashley Morgan's article in The Conversation, where she's talking a little bit about BBC Sherlock and his kind of toxicity, she says, quote, "For example, the BBC Sherlock often tells people around him to shut up to allow him to concentrate, or because he finds them annoying. He takes every opportunity to deride the police, often insisting on being the sole source of information. He is always exasperated at other people's lack of brilliance." And she pulls out a quote here, "Dear God, what is it like in your tiny little brains? It must be so boring." While superiority might be a common trait in brilliant people, what makes it toxic is that Sherlock projects himself as totally unique, creative, and the answer to everyone's problems while putting everyone else down. End quote. And that's from Morgan. And so the bit to extract there is that it's not just that he is superior, it's that he does so at the expense of others. And I think, this is a characteristic that comes from the original stories. The original Sherlock can be really dismissive and rude and caustic, but the text is critical of it. The text, by definition, Watson will often critique and comment on this, to the point where a scandal in
Bill Garvey.
I always get it. No, Bohemia is the original name. The short story. That's what always fucks me up, because the Moffat's version of it is clever. To the extent where in that original text, Sherlock loses because of his arrogance and his unwillingness to assume that a woman could be smarter than him. And so I want to try and unpack a bit of the contextual, era that this was happening in. When we get to the next episode, and particularly season 2, I'm going to start to bring in a lot of the historical context of what was happening on Tumblr and the internet at the time, and how that begins to influence the text and the text reading. But to start with, it's really important to just bring up one particular show which you addressed last week, which is The Big Bang Theory. Now, The Big Bang Theory suffers from a similar kind of problem with its portrayal of masculinity that is really complicated to unpack and was happening at roughly the same time. So for those who aren't sort of too au fait with it, The Big Bang Theory, I don't know how you would be. It was for a while the most successful TV show on television for some reason. So The Big Bang Theory centers on a group of friendly nerds as they navigate work, relationships, and finding their place in the world as generally social outsiders. The show's initial conceit is that an attractive woman, Penny, moves in across the hall from the mostly normal Leonard, who is roommates with the extremely challenging and socially awkward Sheldon Cooper. The initial seasons detail Leonard, Sheldon, and their friends, Howard and Raj, as they all try and navigate developing a friendship with Penny, while Leonard consistently fails in his flirtations and attempts to have Penny see him as a viable sexual partner. The show's protagonists are dorky, awkward, non-athletic, and not what we would imagine are typically masculine males, in the Hollywood sense. At first blush, the parallels are kind of obvious. Sherlock and the Big Bang center extraordinarily intelligent men who are socially isolated. It's part of why you brought up last episode. But where BBC Sherlock kind of forgets that Sherlock is gendered for most of it, we'll talk about the episode with the woman, but I think we can, would you agree that, I guess, Sherlock as a text is not that interested in, Sherlock is almost asexual for the most part until he isn't, right? That seems to be, the general trend. Whereas the Big Bang Theory's opening seasons are deeply gendered and have a lot of complex misogyny that is framed as almost forgivable and kind of almost lovable to an extent because of the type of people that these dorks are. There's a video that I highly recommend everybody watch for some extra context, which is the adorable misogyny of the Big Bang Theory by Jonathan McIntosh, where he explains the way that creepy entitled sexist behavior of the show's protagonists is often kind of laughed away as innocent or endearing because like they don't know any better and they're not jocks, like they're not performing masculinity in the way we would expect. And while BBC's Sherlock isn't doing that kind of performative masculinity at the expense of females, there is a tendency for Sherlock to be dismissive and really rude to other characters, and the text says that's fine because of the outcomes it achieves. So on the one hand, you have the Big Bang Theory, where their behavior and their performance of masculinity is excused because they're dorky and it's supposed to be lovable and they don't know any better. Sherlock, it's because of the results that he achieves. And one thing that both shows do a little bit is they'll often position the dorky hero against some typical version of dudes that we should not like or that we should sort of see as undesirable. So, for example, Dimmock is kind of your like normal detective who is curmudgeonly. He's kind of this terse dude, you know, he's just like a normal guy. Whereas you have Sherlock, who, you know, is over the top and you know, dismissive and superior. And equally, you know, very often the Big Bang Theory will position these jocks that Penny is dating in opposition to our core cast of characters, and specifically in opposition to Leonard for the most part. And when our characters interact with these jocks, they'll be, you know, crude and jock-like, and they'll treat women poorly. And so in this way, and by context and proximity, Leonard and his friends are allowed to be framed as like better and smarter and more sensitive alternatives to these typical men. And so too, I think, in contrast with the framing of BBC Sherlock, Sherlock is framed against John's version of masculinity, where John's pursuit of women in the show is framed as harmless and almost endearing. He asks out, for the most part, almost all of the women he encounters on screen. But it's not weird, like it's framed as normal in contrast to Sherlock's inability to connect with people, let alone flirt or like be romantically interested. And this is, you know, in the first episode, it's played for a joke, which is, you know, he asks the, not Moriarty,
is a kidnapper, basically, which is the funnier thing.
Mycroft, yes. Mycroft's assistant. I couldn't remember Mycroft's name. Yeah, and it's framed as funny, but it's also not framed as creepy, right? There's something about the performance of Watson here that is naturally just disarming. He's charming, he's nice, we don't see it as weird. But it's kind of like, it's not dissimilar to some of the stuff we see in The Big Bang, where it's framed as harmless and endearing, despite the fact that it can kind of be a little bit like it's a lot. You know, the second interaction he has with Sarah becomes a central proponent of this, where, you know, John ostensibly, you know, picks up on the correct signals, asks her out, and Sherlock takes that opportunity and uses that relationship for the case. And so I guess by proximity, similar to what we see, I guess, in The Big Bang, you get different focal points of what should or how should one perform masculinity in a desirable way. And the answer in this show is Sherlock's superiority and his insistence on combat with other men. When I say combat, I don't mean literally fist fighting. I mean verbal combat, trying to position himself in superiority to them. His insistence on beating Dimmock down until Dimmock relents at the end of the episode. There is an extent to which Sherlock's intellectual superiority becomes desirable, and it is framed against John's innocent, harmless portrayal of masculinity, which we are also kind of supposed to accept as good and healthy and normal. Whereas, you know, both obviously have some challenges and some problems there, but I think it's really indicative of just the time the show was made, more so than anything. That these were things that had gone critically unexamined in mainstream media, and kind of do for the rest of the show as well. This is never a thing that is really addressed. Even with Irene Adler and then Sherlock eventually having a relationship, this is never, I guess, criticized by the text. Whereas at least The Big Bang Theory, as it goes on, tries at times to criticize these behaviors, and our characters do grow and change, but never enough that it kind of overcomes that hurdle. But that's kind of the framing, I guess, of why I think we get Andy with the way that he is, where he is this kind of meek, pathetic, charmless portrayal of a man. We get John, who is like kind of bumbling but cute and charming and non-offensive and non-dangerous. And you get Sherlock, who is kind of Moffat's leading protagonist, who is this yelly, angry, space nerd bully guy. And those are your kind of three axes of of math. Those are the three options you have as a man to be desirable. Is you're either the superior genius who people can't relate to, you're the nice, smart kind of guy who's flirtatious with women but not in an offensive way, or you're the kind of dork who just can't get it done. Those seem to be your options, or you're a meathead, which we see a lot in Moffat's text. Those are kind of his three versions of men, the way that I see it. So I highly recommend that you seek out that video. I think it's really informative. But I suspect that's why we get Dimmick instead of Lestrade, because Sherlock needs someone to perform against, whereas Lestrade would not. He would kind of not rebuff him directly. Lestrade and him have a real respect. Whereas I think we needed someone that Sherlock doesn't respect to show his superiority intellectually. That's my suspicion, at least.
It was interesting. One thing I took away from that is that a way that you could interpret the dismissive nature that Sherlock has towards people who are either actually stupider or just acting stupider in the moment, you could very easily see that as being something that the writers are doing intentionally, because so many people in real life, assuming that 50% of everyone you meet is smart, like whatever percentage of people are smarter than that, you've probably met a lot of people smarter than you, and you've probably met a whole lot of people who are way dumber than you, and at some point you have wanted to say everything Sherlock says. At some point you have looked at someone and thought to yourself, it must hurt to be that stupid. But you can't say that because that's not socially acceptable. And that might be one reason a lot of people love Sherlock, is because he comes out and says the stuff that you can't say. And it makes you feel that intellectual superiority that everyone has felt that at some point in their lives, of having to deal with someone stupider than them. And
yes. that's a huge reason why the show attracted teenagers and why it was a really compelling, like, I mean, I was 17, 18, when it was running, and like that was a really attractive idea because you don't know any better, because you're a dumb teenager, you think you're a fucking genius, and you have this kind of sense of righteousness and sanctimonious intellectual righteousness,
and especially
and
it was college age too, not just teenagers, but like that was like right after college for me and my brother and his a couple years younger. They were all like in grad school and stuff, so they were all like, we're getting our masters, we're brilliant, so we love this, we love this character.
And to your point though, I think that righteousness and that sense of like, I know better, or he's saying the stuff that we can't in polite society. That's really attractive, and you at that age you think that that's something that is desirable. And I think the older you get, the more you realize that like that is a really undesirable way to exist in the world. It is ungenerous to the people around you in a really toxic kind of way. And a lot of the people that liked the show at the time would have liked it for similar reasons, where it's like, that's why you see a lot of Sherlock's one-liners on t-shirts and Tumblr posts and stuff, is that he's saying he's kind of this intellectual edgelord, but at the expense of the people around him, and in particular, at the expense of creating these kind of toxic performances of masculinity. And one thing I think often people forget in these particular kinds of conversations is that when we say something like toxic masculinity, that doesn't just affect women and queer folk. It affects men as well, in particular. And you see that in these stories where the men are victims of Sherlock's need to be superior and need to be combative here. Something that I think is obvious, but I think is worth saying, is that Moffat's Doctor Who has a pretty similar personality and tendencies in his behavior. He will often just like straight up yell at the other characters in the show and kind of bully them around. But one thing that Sherlock does and Doctor Who does under Moffat's run is they both deploy lampshading to avoid criticism. So lampshading is a technique where the writers will deploy a trope or something that they know is problematic, but they will call attention to it and acknowledge it to let us know that they are self-aware. Lampshading is the kind of writing equivalent of, it's a very deflationary tactic where it lets you avoid some criticism, because if somebody says, well, that's sexist, the showrunners can go, yeah, well, we know it's sexist. See, we pointed that out. And Big Bang Theory is full of this stuff, where Leonard exists as a character to lampshade the other guys being misogynistic or creepy, where, Raj and Howard, yeah, thank you. Raj and Howard will be doing something really sexist, and Leonard will be like, "You guys, don't you know that's kind of creepy?" And his kind of flaccid intervention will always be framed as, "Well, but we know it's sexist, so you can't criticize us for it." It's like, no, they are still sexist and shitty guys, and their behavior is being excused constantly.
Yeah, and even
the same thing with
especially Howard,
yeah.
he says that so many times in his interactions with Penny, and he'll come out and just say, "I know this is creepy, but you want to go back to my bedroom?" And
It's just ridiculous.
yeah,
But it's very deflationary in that the writers can avoid criticism. They can avoid committing to something. I mean, Sherlock does it too, right? You have that line in the previous episode where he says, "I'm a high functioning sociopath," or whatever the line is. This show is full of that stuff where the reflexivity of saying we know it's sexist doesn't mean that the show isn't modeling a particular type of behavior that it's constantly endorsing and dismissing from criticism. And again, I'm not saying that you can't do that and then have it be a commentary or critique, but I don't think this text comments or critiques on this stuff. I also wanted to point out two things, which is that Moffat has a tendency to have companions moderate and modulate the behavior of his big, rude leading men. You obviously see that with Clara and Amy in Doctor Who, where the Doctor will constantly be checking with him to see if he was too rude or said the wrong thing. Clara in particular, as their romantic chemistry develops, that becomes a really well realized version of that, where it's less representative and it's actually more engaging. Sherlock kind of does this with John, where he's like, well, was that too rude or was that not? But John never really holds him accountable necessarily. So this is certainly a theme in Moffat's storytelling, which is that if you have someone who's a big intellectual jerk who bullies people around, there must by necessity be someone next to them telling them, that was the wrong thing to do, but never actually intervening or encouraging self-growth.
it's kind of interesting,
And that's
because
where, yeah.
every time that the Doctor did that, I had always interpreted that as the alien asking the human, "Was that okay?"
It's very generous of you.
Apparently it is, because I could definitely see what you're saying. It's just interesting that I had never really thought about it from the gender perspective.
I think the only reason that I think it's so focused and visible there is that you compare it to Russell T Davies' characterizations of the Doctor and the way that his female characters are written, and so often the interactions are not gendered in that way, and it is more about the alien thing that you're talking about, where you say in particular, David Tennant's interpretation has a lot of weird quirks and stuff that feel like it's because he's a dude that bangs around a fucking spaceship. He's not a human. Whereas certainly a lot of, and maybe it's just because I've read so much of Moffat's writing, but I can kind of see the through line there and the connective tissue to, if he weren't writing both shows at once, I would be more willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But because he's writing both characters to behave this way, Sherlock is not an alien. It becomes pretty obvious that there is something else happening here. I just wanted to bed those concepts down. They'll come back later. So let me just grab my place again. So, okay, yeah. We'll touch on a few scenes and then we'll have a quick halftime break. So Sherlock finds a book that was recently checked out from a nearby library in Lucas's apartment. Sherlock and John go to that library for some reason to look for the books that Lucas checked out, not knowing that there's any connection to the case. This is just a real blind guess. They find more of the painted symbols on the bank, on the shelf, more of the painted symbols from the bank on the shelf. This is an insane coincidence that they pick up a book and decide to go to this library. I don't understand this at all.
The books were hyper obvious from the way that the camera treated everything when you're coming up the staircase. It's very obvious that the audience was supposed to, to key in that he's got all of these books and that they're somehow relevant to what's going on. But how Sherlock picks up the one book that was the recent one still baffles me. Like, if it wasn't open, it wasn't fallen, like it had just been, it was just like lying on top, if I remember correctly. There's so many things about this that are just confusing, aside from him picking the right book and then deciding to go back to the library. But one of the more confusing parts about the whole thing is that Sherlock doesn't know what the Dewey Decimal System is because he was looking on the wrong side of the bookshelf.
So this is like a thing that starts to happen, and it's a callback to the. This is my Moffat moment for the episode. Do you know why he doesn't know that?
Oh, is that the planet thing? It doesn't matter to him.
Yeah. So so Sherlock doesn't know about it's in the original short stories. Sherlock doesn't know about astrology, and Watson makes fun of him for it. And Sherlock's explanation is he's like, "That's not useful information to me, so I don't retain it." It's actually one of the first things that happens in those short stories. Is Sherlock explains to him that your mind is like an attic. And this is where Moffat goes insane and develops this mind palette stuff. He's like, your mind is like an attic where you can only hold so much furniture and so much stuff. So it's important to decide what you do want to move in and what you don't want to retain. And so for me, astrology is just not like it's not useful in my everyday life. In the Moffat school of being smart about stuff, there is a point in one of the short stories, and I can't remember which. I should have written it down. Someone at me or someone at Patreon let me know, because I'm sure someone in Patreon will know this. There is a short story where it comes up that Sherlock doesn't understand how the public library works, like how you borrow books and stuff like that. It's a Moffat thing of like, of course he's looking on the wrong side. He wouldn't understand. Like it's that level of like a galaxy brain. Could be a really clever reference, could just be an accident.
Well, yeah, that's what I was about to say, is if this was on purpose, and if this ties in with the galaxy thing later on, then I love it, because they're setting consistent character traits, and they're sticking to them. So from a writing perspective, that's awesome. But does it make sense or not? I don't know. And like, frustratingly for you, I so empathize with that point of view, because the amount of stuff that I don't know on purpose always shocks people. They're like, you don't.
Listen, don't get me wrong. I'm the same. Like, I 100% am on that. I am 1,000. I don't have any problem with that point of view. I'm that person as well. People who've watched my shows for long enough will know I just don't retain stuff that I don't care about. But like, my issue with it is not the characterization. It's that I can see through the fucking Matrix, and I can see what he's trying to do here. And it's very Moffat. Or it's an accident, and that's part of the charm of the Moffat moment. Is it's either a galaxy brain reference, or it's just an oopsie, and it was completely coincidental.
Gotcha. Well,
and that's the real special sauce of Stephen Moffat.
So 2 more things about that scene. One of them was, and this harkens back to the statue that we saw at the very beginning when Su Lin reacts to it, but he sees the paint on the wall. Lucas sees the paint on the wall, then goes running out of the library. While he's terrified and running back home, he stops to check out the book.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise I wouldn't.
Checking that cipher.
So he's scared and running for his life, but he...
Oh, before he's checked the book. Why wouldn't you check the book in the library when you're looking at the cipher?
But then that's the second part of my question, which harkens back to the Su Lin thing, is that these people seem to know what the cipher is without having to read the book to see what the cipher is. Because she pulls the sheet off of the statue and screams, and it's that quick. So she already knew the code for dead man, which makes no sense. That's not how it should work. And it's the same with this guy. Like, he didn't have the book with him. He did not have the cipher book with him at that time. He only had the book that he checked out from the library. So he sees the code,
but
it scares him for some reason, and then he runs back home while he stops to check out the book properly so he doesn't break the rules, and then he goes home. That part's still...
That's dumb, but also, like, it makes a better dramatic scene, so I forgive that logic break. I'm fine with that. Like, I'm not gonna cinema sin. I'm not gonna ding that on my cinema sins bingo card. I think that's fine. Bending the rules slightly for dramatic. To what extent the dramatic framing works? Like you said, it would have been better to see the image that Sulin was looking at. Same with Lucas. Like, I don't understand why we see him running back Like the libraries are not a mystery. Like that's done. Like you know what I mean. Like there are other ways you could do this where they pick up the, they check something and they quickly shut something down and then they're aghast.
Yeah.
You could have started to frame that it was a cipher earlier, and you do away with some of the logical fallacies here. But I mean, I don't know. I forgive it. I think the eagle-eyed viewer notices the book, and when in the next scene Sherlock picks it up, we go, how the fuck did he know to pick that one up?
Well, the bigger issue that I think there is, and I was trying to figure out when to bring this up, but when Van Koon is killed, Sherlock says that he was killed in this fashion because he was refusing to answer his phone and refusing to answer emails, so there was no other way to get in touch with him other than leaving the cipher at his office. Right?
Okay.
The same things happens with the other two characters. So both Su-Lin theoretically was ignoring her emails, she was ignoring her phone, and Lucas was ignoring all of this other method of communication. So the only way to reach these people was to put these ciphers in random places that they frequently go to. But the criminals know where these people live because they keep killing them in their houses. So why not leave the cipher at their flippin' house, where they would...
Yeah, I did have that note as well. I guess I've literally written down, I guess the symbols were painted at places the victims went regularly, but this is needless as it could have been in or outside of Lucas's flat.
Yeah, because, like, what are the odds that Lucas would go to that section and get that book? Because if he didn't, then he would never, ever have seen that. And, like, with Su-Lin, like, she was not working... That was I'm pretty sure, a Roman sculpture, which she does not work on. She would never have gone and taken that sheet down, but she just lucked into it. So...
Huh. Yeah. That just seems like it would have been covered in a second draft, where they're like, okay, let's maybe revise a little bit about how we're going to shoot some of this stuff.
Yeah, but if I've learned anything from analyzing the recent Star Wars movies, it's that I don't think Hollywood believes in like second drafts and having actual editors and proofreaders. And
Yeah.
Do they do that?
They ain't big fans of that one.
Isn't that just a college thing?
It's just a novel thing. Just do it for actual books. Yeah, look, I think that's a good point. I also wonder to what extent you could, and again, we'll be saying this an awful lot in this series. Minor kind of massaging here would make a lot of this track a lot more smoothly and logically. And that just does come from like a bit more attention to detail in kind of a second or third draft. And it feels like a lot of this is very much the first stab at it was the best stab, and they just went, yeah, that'll do. Which is very kind of emblematic of how Doctor Who ends up by the time he leaves. Okay, so back at 22-1B, Baker, Sherlock and John try to piece together the symbols. It's clear the shooter threatened Van Koon by spraying the message at the bank. Van Koon then went home, locked himself in, and hours later, Van Koon was killed. The shooter then left the message at the library for Lucas, and later that night, Lucas was killed. Sherlock realizes the graffiti symbols are ciphers of some ancient code. I think that this is like obvious. I don't know. I was never like, well, these are just random symbols. Like, I don't know. I just think it's a weird, it seems like a needless scene. I'm gonna say that a lot, where they just seem to pad for runtime.
Well, I guess probably because you almost never see a unknown language that turns out to be completely and utterly made up. Because there's one Tolkien. Like, people don't make up entire languages. Like, if you see something, it exists somewhere else in history. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, the fact that he didn't immediately start trying to figure out what language is this, and instead just thinks that it's a made up symbol, is a bit confusing. It's not to say that people don't make up their own cryptography, because obviously that's a fandom out there. People do it, but it can't be that prevalent.
It also, your first guess should be like, what language is this? And like that should have been the first thing that it's a weird first point of inquiry, I guess, like you say.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sherlock and John go to talk to an expert, a street graffiti artist named Raz. In the Moffat tradition of everybody has single syllable names if they're street people. Raz identifies the type of paint, but has no idea what the cipher represents and agrees to do some inquiries. There's no more time for conversation as two community officers come around and they spot them. Raz and Sherlock book it, leaving John holding the bag with Raz's spray paint. Literally holding the bag. Comedy gold. I like the fact that Sherlock says, I need to ask for advice from somebody. I think that's really cool. We get a brief glimpse into him needing knowledge from somebody else. It's the only time this ever happens. The other times it happens in the show is because he's lazy. But it's cool. It's him being like, I need to go to an expert. I like it.
The problem is it just does not... Maybe it just doesn't end up making sense, but like he is trying to figure out what the language says. And in order to figure out what the language says, he's like, let me go talk to a street youth. And I don't see the logic. Like, even if he could figure out what type of paint it is, and then what is he going to go to every paint store in London and figure out who sold the paint to whom? Like, I don't understand how the graffiti artist ends up leading him anywhere. Like, the idea of him asking for help, the idea of it being a street youth, all of that stuff is fine. It's just the practicality of it makes absolutely no sense to me.
This also isn't a lead they follow ever. They don't follow where the paint came from in the episode.
Yeah, which is something that I have.
Like, they do nothing with this information.
Yeah, I have that later on when they go to the skate park. That scene has no purpose to the story whatsoever.
It's weird. Yeah. I mean, God damn it. This is the problem. Is anytime something good happens, I'm like, yeah, I like that, and you look at it for too long, and you're like, oh, I don't like that. God damn it, Steven. Because this is something else the Elementary does really well is that Sherlock ends up having a bunch of recurring characters he goes to for help with specific stuff, and they become his regulars if you're familiar with the spin-offs and stuff of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And it becomes really interesting because he develops these like ongoing relationships with these people he needs help from, and if he fucks up his interpersonal relationships, they're less likely to help him in investigations. It becomes a real point of growth for that character because he has to actually be a bit vulnerable and maintain these long-term relationships. And when they call him asking for help, he goes and helps them. This is like, it's like, oh, we almost had something, and then it completely just goes, nah, this is the only time that Raz will make an appearance, just this one time.
I wonder if that might have been, this was the writer's first thought at his homeless network, and that's where the idea came from, was from having Raz involved. And
yeah,
I mean, you're like, it may not work, it may be silly, but I also just love the idea that that option is there, and it's kind of obvious to think about, but no one would have thought about it.
Look, this is the problem with everybody is a type of guy. It's a problem that Cameron Kunzelman talks about in fiction a lot, which is that a lot of the time in slightly alternative imaginings of reality, people get kind of flattened down to being a type of guy. Raz is like a type of guy in this. I'm doing scare quotes for anybody listening. Raz is a type of guy in the sense that he is like the rough tumble street youth who does graffiti, right? Lestrade is a type of guy in that he is like the kind of put upon head of the gruff put upon detective head of police. A better example of this is if you look at sci-fi, they do this a lot, right? Particularly like dystopian sci-fi. Every character in a Fallout game is a type of guy. One of the challenges you end up with an idea like the homeless network, aside from just being like incredibly complicated in the way that is sort of offensive, is that everybody involved in that is the same type of guy. It suggests that all of the members of the dehoused community are the same type of person. They are all the same archetype. They all have the same kinds of relationships. Now, that kind of stereotyping is fine. Like, you're allowed to do that in stories. Sometimes it's important to be like, this is a police officers. We have a series of assumptions about police officers. We assume they'll do certain things, right? You can do that. Your challenge is in the way that you codify those different characters. How do you do so in a way that gives the audience the information they need without being really dismissive of the people that are underlying that type of guy? The best example I can think of is I rewatched The Batman last night, which is honestly like a 11 out of 10 film. And one of the things that does that I really enjoy is the police in that story are police in inverted commas. They are like very, very stereotypical, but they all have a level of nuance and complexity where, as the story goes on, a few key policemen become not central to the story, but they have enough to do and enough to change and grow that the police aren't just a type of guy. There are many people who make up the police. And so when we get talking, when we will talk about it with something like the Homeless Network or someone like Raz, Raz is a person, right, who represents a type of guy. The Homeless Network are a group of a type of guys. And in fiction, that becomes a really challenging thing to kind of comprehend in a sense, which is that it's okay to stereotype and code a group of people. Your job as a fiction writer is to find a way to then show us that there are people that are within, that represent that broader kind of picture. Not that everybody is the same person within that, because then you just have like a collective, right? Then it's like, well, you may as well just say the X, right? The orcs, the goblins. They don't have individual personalities. They're representative of some kind of like larger semiotic group that doesn't actually exist in real life. Like, dehoused people don't have, they don't all talk to each other. They don't all communicate across a city. They have individual relationships and communities and territories and lives and meaning and jobs and different things they do. And so I think that flattening that stuff is fine, but you have to then own the fact that you're doing that and either do something with it or accept the criticism that like super, super offensive.
Yeah. Well, to bring that back to like the end of that scene was the cops coming up and John gets caught holding the bag while Sherlock and Raz run off, right? Mm-hmm. And a huge problem that I had with that, because that it harkens back to the beginning of the episode with having a row with the machine. Like, getting caught holding the bag was funny. It was acted well. I love the scene. It doesn't make sense for the character, because the entire first episode was about him having like strong reactions, strong physical reactions to danger, being quick-witted, all of this kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he turns into a bumbling idiot who doesn't run away when danger happens, and when his accomplices run away and he doesn't think, oh, I need to run. Like, everything in that scene, like, they dumbed down his character for a comedic moment.
Also, the police see the other two running away.
And they just let him go. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like that, or it's like if he's like, I didn't do this, and you look at him and he has no paint on his fingers and he's this white-collar dude, you probably didn't do it, guy. Like, you know what I mean? I don't know. That's, yeah. But I mean, it's funny. He gets an ASBO, which is fine.
Yeah, more British terminology that I had to Google.
Incredible. I only know that because my family are from England. So to find out what links Van Koon and Lucas together, Sherlock traces Van Koon's footsteps on the day he was killed. John does the same thing with addresses from Lucas's diary. Just to kind of zip through what they do. So Sherlock talks to Van Koon's personal assistant, Amanda. She has all of his receipts, but notes there is a gap in her boss's schedule on the day he was killed. Amanda admits that Van Koon was not that appreciative of her. He was only appreciative of expensive things, though Sherlock notices a bottle of expensive hand cream that he might have bought for her. Examining the receipts, Sherlock finds some very interesting details. Van Koon took a taxi out to the West End, but a ticket shows that he took the London Underground to get back, apparently signifying that Van Koon lugged a heavy package up the escalator. There's also a receipt from a coffee shop that he stopped at on the way back. Sherlock continues to follow the receipts and runs into John, who is retracing Lucas's steps. So that's why I might pause there. So I like this kind of working their way back through the days sequence, this little montage here. It's cool. We get to see Amanda's hairpin, and we have the hand cream get called attention to again, just to remind us that it's going to be important later. Just like solid fiction writing here, solid detective writing here. I also like Sherlock's interactions with Amanda. There's a sort of a way in which you could see a version of Sherlock that gets along with people being presented here, where he's just like generally friendly to her, that I like.
It's also interesting from a gender point of view that this is it the first woman we see him interact with that he's not dismissive of her or using her in some fashion?
I would say so, yeah.
I don't know if that really gives us anything interesting into his character. It's probably an accident that happened to be in there whatsoever.
I think it's probably proof that like that when he is not being gendered, he's allowed to be normal and just like a person that could talk to people. And when he's either being gendered or placed in that role of superiority, that's when we get into some challenges. Because he's not trying to assert his dominance here. He's not trying to prove a point. He's just interacting as part of the case. It's probably what I would, and that probably speaks to the relationship between aggression, superiority, and intelligence and masculinity that this show seems to like kind of interweave potentially.
I'm like you. I really like the way that the deduction in that scene was done, especially because once you think about it, like she had all of those receipts because you have to turn in your receipts or you don't get reimbursed for stuff.
Yeah.
So it actually like tracks logically. But then at the same time, we have to go back and think about where this dude works, how much money he's making, and then what his commissions probably are on all of these things. And then think about how often rich people actually would take a tube anywhere. Because if it's like subways in America, they would rather walk.
Similar vibe. I mean, the tubes are a bit less stabby than America, but the similar vibes. I also, I mean, I suppose this was an era before it was common for just like all this stuff to be done via like a business credit card. Like a lot of the time, if I need to expense something at work, I don't need a receipt. I just go, well, it was like you can tell from the credit card transaction what it was for. Yeah, but it's still cool. I like them following a trail. Like they're actually doing detective work for once.
Yeah,
it's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I could let that one slide. It just kind of hit me that I wonder if there's a different way to do the travel portion, that would be a little more realistic. Like, does he not have most people take their car to work? Did he not have his own car? Although in bigger
it's
cities,
London. It's yeah. So London, no one drives. This is like a real like. So for me, the reason none of this clocked is weird is like, you don't drive anywhere in London. You either get a cab or you get the tube. Those are your two options, really.
Yeah, I mean that tracks really strong with the rest of Sherlock, because they're always taxiing everywhere. It just never really clocked with me about why they do that, but I have heard people talk about that before. One thing that I noticed was a huge missed opportunity was when they both John, after he looks through the journal and he figures out to go to the Cat Emporium place, and then Sherlock finds his way there after looking at the receipts, and then the line of dialogue that leads Sherlock there, and he's like, "Oh, he got peckish," and then that's how he knew where to go to the. I don't know if that was a good line or a dumb line, but
just the delivery is very weird. It's a very strange thing for a grown-ass man to say.
Yeah, but so anyway, he and John accidentally run into each other right outside that coffee shop or whatever, right? And then there was a huge missed opportunity for some like actual organic humor where, because John has the answer, he knows that it's the place across the street. Sherlock does not know. Sherlock is trying to go through all these deductions, and Sean is like, wait, and John is like, wait, stop, it's that place right there. And Sherlock is like, how do you know? That was the moment for humor right then, because John has been waiting for this moment. He has been waiting to know something Sherlock doesn't know.
Wouldn't it be great if he invented the way that he deducted it?
Yeah.
Like, deduced it? Like, he should have had some, you know, it was like, well, you could tell from the angle of the paint splotch, like, some bullshit invention. And Sherlock could be like, wow, like, I didn't realize you were learning so much from me already. You know, like, you could have... Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah.
Missed opportunity, guys.
And it's not just the missed opportunity, but it's the idea to me that was organic humor. So much of the humor that we've seen so far in this episode does not track with the characters, and with like John having the row with the machine at the very beginning of it doesn't seem to track with his personality from the last episode. And some of the different stuff we've seen just doesn't track with their personalities over what we've seen. But this feels like it would have fit perfectly, and that's just not something that seems that easy to write, and they lucked into it and missed it.
Yeah, and they almost do it too. Like, they're like this close to this scene being really funny. It is humorous, but it's not. They don't actually do it. Well, so I think what we'll do, let's take a quick break and come back, and then we'll talk about the the solve around Van Koon and Lucas, and then the kind of the Lucky Cat Emporium and how that all starts to fit in. So we'll be right back. Give Up to 3 is a production of Zero Indent. We are an independent, reader-funded publication. It takes a tremendous amount of research, time, and dedication to create the weird niche shows we do. We know this content isn't for everyone, and we take actions to actively dissuade parasocial relationships in our content. So we're never going to guilt you into contributing or suggest that we just do it for the fans. Instead, we're a bunch of passionate creatives who like making content about creativity, storytelling, and writing. If you'd like to support us, you can do so at patreon.com/zeroindent. As little as $1 a month really does make a difference and helps us buy more time to make our shows and articles even better. If not, maybe tell a friend who you think would enjoy the show, or maybe who watched Sherlock when it first came out. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of this episode. Alright. So basically, Sherlock starts to explain to John that Van Koon must have dropped off a heavy package in the area, and John immediately points to the Lucky Cat Emporium, an oriental curio shop across the street, noting that Lucas wrote down the address in his diary. Inside, they discover that many of the goods have numbers on them in the same symbols as the cipher. Sherlock invents a language called Hangzhou numerals, an ancient Chinese numerical system now only used by traders. Sherlock determines that the numbers at the bank are 15 and 1. As they leave, a mysterious woman takes photos of them. I don't have a lot to add here except the thing you called out earlier, which is that, like, we have no way of knowing what this language is.
Well, the interesting thing is that once he knows what it is, he knows what it is. And that just doesn't make sense. Like, he knows it's Hangzhou, so he knows what the letters of Hangzhou look like, but he doesn't recognize them when he sees them. And he
doesn't have to go and do like research or anything. Yeah.
I mean, unless he's just seen that Hangzhou was an ancient language and he's never actually seen the written text before. But that doesn't really track. Most of the time when you're like, if you're reading something about ancient German, there will be like a little excerpt of what ancient German looked like. So it just seems really weird that he would know what it was without knowing what it looked like.
It also doesn't make so it's also this missed opportunity to get Andy back involved in the story.
Yeah.
Because I could see a different version of this where it's like, hey, you work with this chick, you work in the same department to help us understand the language, and he could explain how it works. And we could then, as the audience, be given an opportunity to understand how it works, right? Yeah. I have another little gripe here in the next scene, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else on that one before they go to Sulin's place?
No. I think we're all good.
Okay, so Sherlock and John go to a restaurant across the street, which is making me hungry to think about because it's lunchtime here. And Sherlock tells John about a possible motive for the killings. He remembers Seb telling them that Van Koon lost £5 million in 1 week, but made it all back the following. Now Sherlock knows why. Van Koon was smuggling illegal antiques. The idea that both Van Koon and Lucas were smugglers is not that far-fetched, given their cover careers. Van Koon was a businessman making frequent trips to Asia. Lucas was a journalist writing about China. Both of them must have smuggled things back in their suitcases and used the Lucky Cat as their delivery point. Sherlock thinks that one of them stole something from his employer, but since the killer does not know which one took it, he had to kill them both, which is an interesting assumption. Okay, hang on. This is fine. I don't have too many gripes with this, but I just think like the assumption that like they didn't know who took it, so they killed them both. That seems like that's creating a lot of risk and exposure when you could just like interrogate one of them and find out the answer. Like, I don't know. I'm not a criminal mastermind, so I don't know if that's maybe I don't know. They would do something different. They know something I don't.
Yeah.
You know?
And it's also interesting to kind of think about what Van Koon's job was, because first Sherlock says they're going to the bank. And then once they get there, they find out that Van Koon was a day trader. So now the bank is also doing trades on the stock market, which maybe that's a normal thing, but that just doesn't really track.
Is that how? I don't think banks do that.
Yeah. Yeah, they really should not.
You would trade currency for sure.
But still, no. So no matter what the answer to that question is, the bigger question is, how is Van Koon getting the money from these sales, this illegal money, into his trading account at the bank to make up for what he lost the week before.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because that's got to be a lot of financial acrobatics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they would need a
I don't know,
way
man.
bigger team involved in this. Granted, they say that there's like thousands of people in this network, but he would need people at the bank helping him get through all the red tape of getting the illegal money into the system. So, like, the entire thing doesn't really work with him selling the stuff to cover what he lost at his job, which also the bad guys would not care about. Like, they would not give him a $5 million thing to pay off what he lost, because that's where this entire thing came from, was him stealing a $9 million thing, and they want it back. So, like...
He also doesn't sell it. He doesn't sell the jade hairpin. He gives it to the assistant.
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't. That's not how he makes the money.
Yeah, the assumption was that he sold something else, and then he made the $5 million on it, and then that went all to his bank to pay off what he lost the week before. But then, what did the triad get if he gave away all the money? Like, so many things about his interaction with this via his business don't really track.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be generous again. I haven't thought about it too much because I think the show is going, businessman stuff. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Like business type dealings, and we're supposed to go, yeah, business type dealings, whatever. Like, because it's not the central focus of the show. I'm sure there's an explanation there, but that we don't need to know about. I think to your point though, it's about consistency, and it's about like making sure that we can track what's going on. And I think it misses sometimes with this in this mode of storytelling, where the fact that you noticed it means that like there's something it's doing here that isn't working. I don't know. I didn't notice it because like I just went. The show is dismissive of bankers and what they do, so I'm not too worried about it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't.
Maybe that's just
I wouldn't fail the student's essay on this. I would just be like, do better.
Yeah, do better next time.
Yeah.
One of the things I used to do when I was marking papers was I would. If somebody had put in like a really good short story or something like that, but it just wasn't quite there, you'd be like, yeah, like really, really great work. Here's all the stuff that you've done well. I'm going to give you a 7, like really, really great job. But next time this would be a 6. Like if you don't improve, what are we doing here?
An encouraging threat.
Yeah, it's a threat. Listen, it's a good kind of threat. Okay, it's fine. So Sherlock is distracted when he notices a wet phone book package next to an apartment adjacent to the Lucky Cat, which just happens to be Su Len Yao's. He climbs up the fire escape and goes inside through the window. He kind of goes through the apartment, realizes that someone else is inside and still there. A shadowy figure ambushes him and chokes him almost to the point of unconsciousness, dropping a black paper lotus on the floor. And just as Sherlock is about to pass out, the intruder suddenly releases him and runs out. Sherlock staggers downstairs and lets John in. He explains they need to find Su Len. When he spots Andy's note, though he's noticeably wheezy from his near-death experience, John asks if he's getting a cold, but Sherlock insists he's fine and they need to go to the museum. Now, the Yellow Pages thing. When I went back and I watched the previous scene of Andy going to the apartment for the first time, and you don't see the fucking Yellow Pages. Why? Why not just have them there? Like, this is so bizarre to me. This is like an easy win. This isn't like we need to somehow just put the prop in the scene that we need to know about later. I don't understand this. I was like, this made me mad at how easy this would have been for us to be like, oh my god, if only I'd seen that earlier, I would have worked it out. I
want to pull a you from what you just said a minute ago. Like, I could let this one go because, and this is a point that I have written down somewhere later on, that we don't really know how many days this entire thing takes place over. But my interpretation was that when Andy went there was not the same day as all of this was happening. And Sherlock says, judging by the amount of rain, that the phone book was out there for 3 days or something like that. I don't know. So that would be one interpretation, was that Andy went there before the book was even delivered. But
Yeah, but we also don't get an opportunity to see where the book is. Like, if the book wasn't there and we saw the empty stoop, and then there's a phone book there later, like, we don't even get to see the same part of the apartment facade isn't shot.
yeah,
Like, we don't even see it in the first scene.
I mean, I like what you're saying, that I would always prefer that something be hinted at beforehand. But the bigger problem that I have is what the purpose was whatsoever. Like, there had to be somebody else who did not take their newspaper in. Was Sherlock just running up and down the street saying, "Oh, look, there's an old paper. Let's break into that house"? Like, why did that phone book trigger him to go and break into the house? It makes no sense aside from the fact that it's attached to the Cat Emporium. Like, it's
I don't
so
know.
coincidental.
It really is. But I mean, that's the mode that this story is in now, which is like coincidences are now. There is no such thing as a coincidence. Everything is connected, and Sherlock is the one who knows how it's connected.
Yeah. So the unfortunate realization is, like, why did that scene have to be in there? And that scene had to be in there, just like the first one, the row with the vending machine. That scene had to be there in order for John to get Sherlock's credit card. That's why that scene was ultimately included. The reason that this scene is ultimately there is so that we hear John shouting, "I am Sherlock," or whatever dialogue that he says.
Yeah.
So this scene has to happen with Sherlock inside, separate from John, so that the bad guys hear him calling himself Sherlock.
Because the store is next door. Yeah, okay. That that's really frustrating, because I mean, this show does that a lot, though, where it works backwards from a conclusion and then doesn't really cover its tracks properly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, like I had pointed out before, this is the second time that we've had so far where Sherlock is fighting a bad guy and refuses to tell John about it. And again, I don't know what they're building up to, but we had the sword guy at the beginning, now we got this fight here, and John is just in the dark about the whole thing.
This doesn't end up going anywhere in this episode, either. Like, it doesn't pay off in any way.
Yeah, well...
I had never thought about that, but it just literally does nothing.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sherlock, but man, that's do better.
I mean, and I am positive the fight that they have later at the circus, I am positive if they had not, like, burst through the curtain and been fighting in front of everyone, he would not have told John. There is no way he would.
Why?
Because for whatever reason, they are making that part of his character. Like, he gets in fights and he doesn't tell the parent.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I guess so. Doesn't tell his big brother. Do you have anything else on the apartment before we move on back to the museum?
The deduction stuff was interesting, and you could follow it along. You didn't really need to see anything ahead of time. The fact that he, like, smells the milk, like, it's kind of brilliant how simple that is to gauge how long someone's been gone.
Yeah.
The one thing that, or actually there were at least two things that were insanely stupid. He could gauge just by seeing the footprint of how heavy the guy was. Maybe.
So
I know that's like an old Indian thing and tracking, but this was on a carpet.
Yeah, but so, like, the thing that you need, so the thing for that technique to work, welcome to Stephen Moffat's Clever Corner again. The thing that he's doing there is, in one of the early Sherlock Holmes stories, Sherlock teaches you how to gauge the height of somebody based on their footprint. But you need a second point of reference. So, for example, if you have a footprint of the murderer and the victim's body, the angle of the blow combined with the foot size will tell you roughly the height and the weight. But you need a second point of reference in order to do that calculus. And so I think this is probably one of those Moffat kind of school of things where he's like, well, the original Sherlock knew how to do that, so let's just have him know this information. He doesn't compare that to a second point of data, which is a critical thing in that actual ability to solve it in real life.
It may be the same thing for the second point, which is there's a picture that the bad guy had picked up, and because the thumbprint of the bad guy was still on the picture, Sherlock deduced that he was very strong.
What?
Right?
Does that really happen? I must have blacked out when it happened.
It's right after the footprint thing.
Fuck? Why would that mean? Because he gripped it firmly?
Yeah, I guess.
Gripping it softly would still leave a fingerprint, though.
Yeah, it's glass. I mean, just
That's baffling. What are you talking? That's Steven. What are we doing?
do better.
What are we doing? That's so confusing. Okay, I mean, no, I got nothing for you there. That could be a reference to something in the original story. Someone let me know if it is. Bizarre. Anything else in that scene?
No, that's it.
Okay, so Sherlock and John talk to Andy back at the museum, who explains that Sulin resigned, and the last thing he remembers her do was the demonstration of the tea ceremony at the start of the episode. Andy shows them her locker, and Sherlock notices a nearby statue with 2 of the ciphers painted with the exact same yellow paint. As the 2 men leave, the same woman from earlier watches them. Plot thickens. Who is she? We don't know.
I also
If you're
laughed.
paying attention, we've met her already.
I laughed at the scene right outside of the apartment where she's taking the photo of them, and she is like sorority girl, blatantly holding the phone out way in front of her. She's supposed to be like a super secret, assassin person, and she's like, "Ooh, let me snap this photo over here." It's the most.
Also, couldn't have afforded a DSLR. Like, what are we doing?
Yeah, or even just like very subtly, you just like something like this. I don't know. It just doesn't. The way that these assassins act just doesn't track with what you would expect assassins to act like.
I've never met an assassin, but I would assume they would be a little more subtle.
Yeah,
for sure.
You would assume.
Yeah. This also is like a big villain problem this show has, where it's like never quite sure what kind of villains it should have and like how they should behave, and like it just it's never really sure what kind of how fantastical they are and how dramatic they are. We'll kind of talk about that at the end, I guess. But so Raz meets up with him at a tube station where someone has written more ciphers using the same paint. They spread out and search, and Sherlock finds a can of the discarded spray paint. John then subsequently finds a wall with more of the graffiti and snaps a photo. John, by the time he grabs Sherlock, the wall has been painted over. It's a minor detail that we'll talk about. They go back home, and John begins to pass out due to lack of sleep. As Sherlock realizes the numbers are all pairs, the killer left them to communicate with the thief and demand the return of the stolen item. Okay, so I think that the graffiti skate park tube terminal station type vibe is some interesting world building. I like the idea that if there is this network that Raz belongs to of kind of choreographed graffiti experts, it gives this version of London some interesting texture that I think is kind of abandoned later on. Like this is if they revisited this as a concept, it could have been a really cool thread to pull on. It doesn't really end up going anywhere, but I think it's cool world building nonetheless. As they're doing this search, Sherlock stops to grab the address of the deadly Chinese bird spider circus. We don't really see it in frame long enough to clock it as anything, but like later on when he's like, "Oh yeah, the circus," you go, "Did he? Oh yeah, he did. I remember that." So it's you get to at least see him recognizing that. One thing I did enjoy was Sherlock. Nice.
That's not water, is it? That's the problem. Is that straight vodka?
Yes. So much vodka. It's actually gin. So Sherlock starts doing this so basically John sees the symbols, and then when he comes back, the wall's painted over, and Sherlock grabs him and he's like, "Listen, you got to bloody remember, close your eyes, activate your visual memory, humans only have a 62% accurate visual memory, blah, 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 blah." And then John's like, "I took a photo." And I think it's cool. You see some of John's value, which is his practicality here, his pragmatism in the face of Sherlock's constant aloofness. You can kind of see that there is some value that John brings to the table,
and it
like.
Being organic humor, like I said before. Like it's something that the audience will find funny and that tracks with both characters' personalities and fits with their character traits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. It just feels right. I'll try and move us along here because we're really getting in the weeds. They go back to the museum to ask Andy for more information. As they talk, Sherlock notices that one of the teapots Sulin was obsessed with has been freshly polished since the last time they were there. Sherlock deduces that Sulin is revisiting the museum after hours to maintain the pot. an interesting assumption, but one that like presumably someone else at the museum would be probably keeping these going. Anyway, I think that absent that, I think the teapot is a clever narrative hook. It's the first thing we get shown. Andy tells us how they work, and we get reminded a third time when we first visit Andy in the museum. And because of the this pretty straightforward screenwriting, we could have thought of the teapot by ourselves to the point where, as the gang revisits the museum with Andy, the teapot is in the center of the frame for about 5 seconds before Sherlock calls attention to it. Like they're standing literally behind it, and it's in the center of the frame. I think it's just like really straightforward, good screenwriting. We could have worked this out for ourselves beforehand. It's clever. I like it.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we get into the real plot and the meat and potatoes of the thing. So that night, Sherlock and John discover Sulin is hiding in the museum, and she explains that the code, the ciphers, are the work of the Black Lotus Tong, of which she was once a member. She explains that the killer is Shi Zhu, the spider, who is also her brother. She shows them a Tong tattoo on the heel of her right foot, which resembles a lotus flower, and explains that everyone who smuggles for them bears this mark. She explains that she and Shushi had no choice but to join the Black Lotus after their parents died. And she also explains that by the time she was 17, she was smuggling thousands of pounds worth of drugs across the border into Hong Kong, and she gave up the life and came to London, but Shi Zhu has tracked her down after 5 years. John asks how well she knows Shi Zhu, which is where she reveals that he is her brother. That he became a puppet of the Tong in the power of General Shan, the Black Lotus's general. When she refused to help him, he accused her of betraying him and left the ciphers behind as a threat. Before she can decode the message for our boys, Shi Zhu strikes again and fatally shoots her, leaving a Black Lotus flower in her hand. John and Sherlock make a break for it and escape with their lives. I really like Sulin's character here. She's well written, she's really well acted. It's a great dramatic scene. It's allowed to have the right weight and depth. We sit in this moment for long enough for it to have an impact where she explains that it's her brother, and then as Shi Zhu arrives, we have that like tragic realization that like he is gonna kill his own sister, and you get that pause when he's about to confront her, where you see him process what he's about to do and then do it anyway. It's a really good balance of action, drama, emotion, and detective work, all just really, really well framed. This scene I think is brilliant.
Yeah, I really liked how slowly they played it, but at the same time, it also felt like it was just it literally was an exposition dump, and it kind of left me thinking like, how much is too much, because we really didn't need to know any of that in order for everything to progress in an understandable fashion, because we know someone is smuggling. We know we're at the end of it, we'll know what the people look like. We don't really need all that exposition they had. Maybe it ties in the characters more, but another thought that I had was that the idea that this random person ends up being her brother was so contrived and so out of the blue that it just felt like unnecessary added drama. You know, it didn't have to be anyone she knew other than the fact that they both worked for the mafia together. You know, making them siblings just adds in. It's like a cheap thing that a writer will do to make the audience feel like I have to be emotionally invested in this scene because they're related. If that wasn't there, then it's like, why should the audience care that this man is going to kill this woman?
True. Yeah. Interesting.
And it was also, because you had mentioned this earlier, it was also interesting how much she cares about these relics, because they don't really go enough. This is the opposite of what I was just saying, that this is an area where they should have gone more into depth of her character. Is why were these teapots worth her giving up her life over? Like, if she had just gone to Arkansas, she would have been fine. But no, she needed to care about these pots that are 400 years old. But why? You know?
Yeah, it's true. You make a valid point. Also, to the thing you said just before, the other thing this does is it makes the world a bit smaller, which is already a problem that Sherlock has deeply that we've talked about a lot, which is that, like, it's already, like, it continues to shrink its world with stuff like this. Yeah, I mean, why does she care about them? You know, how does that relate to her past? Would have been good to find out beforehand. And, you know, she could have had a conversation with Andy about it. Like, there's plenty of opportunity for us to kind of understand what her motivation there is. And, you know, it's as simple as you put in a line where she's like, you know, after a lifetime of doing so much hurt, you know, it's important to me to be able to preserve something beautiful or something.
And it's,
you know, you can add that pathos easily.
And it's funny because the exposition dump actually adds in some problems, because if you think about it, when Shiju shows up, the way that Sulin reacts is like this is the first time that she's seen him in 5 years. That is exactly the reaction that she had. It's not. She saw him 3 days ago. The line was, he came to my flat. He asked me to help him. I told him no. This is the second time in 3 days that she's seen him, but she's acting like it's her first time.
I did not clock that. Okay.
Yeah, it's like I don't know. It's maybe they just acted the second part wrong, and she was supposed to be saying, "Oh, Shiju, you're here to kill me," and it wasn't the interpretation that we're getting from it.
Interesting.
Another interesting thing about the fight scene was Sherlock is chasing around an armed assassin, and Sherlock doesn't have a gun or anything.
That's weird, man.
But
that's weird, man. He just runs out.
Did you notice the assassin was shooting blanks?
Is that on no, well, because there's in the scene where he yells at him, he's like, "Hey, bloody, watch where you're shooting." We pan, like, the camera racks focus, and you see a bullet hole.
I'm gonna have to double check that, because I know there was no sound of breaking glass, there was no sound of ricochets, and when the boss lady is holding the gun later, she says, "We're using real bullets now."
Oh, maybe it was. I'm gonna bring the scene up and double check. It's interesting. Yeah, okay, that's interesting. I also thought that whole bit at the end, I was like, shut the fuck up. Shut the fuck up, Friday, man. What are we doing? Let's see. Looking for bullet holes.
And while you're looking, because I didn't know where to put this, I just thought this was hilarious. Everyone treats the ciphers like they're a threat, and the ciphers are not a threat. They could literally be saying that there's 10% off at Panda Express.
Yeah, they could be mean. They could say anything.
Yeah.
That is interesting. But it's like they all, every time someone looks at one, they're aghast. They're like, "Oh my god, I could die here." This is a grave threat, but it never is. That's interesting. So yeah, okay, I think you might be right. I don't see any bullet holes, so you might be right on the money with that, which is cool. It's good continuity.
Because it also tracks, because the boss lady says, "What does it mean when an assassin is unable to kill you?" And at what point were they actually trying to kill them? Aside from in Sulin's apartment, where when Sherlock is getting choked out, at no other point do they try to actually kill them, unless she's referring to this thing with a gun.
I have some other criticisms of that moment later, but yes, I think it must be this moment. Well, I guess the assassin doesn't kill Sherlock when he could. He leaves him just before he goes unconscious.
But also doesn't make sense, because they think that Sherlock is just a random dude. So
yeah. Look, listen. Yes, and okay. John and Sherlock talk to Dimmock at the police station. Based on what they've learned from Sulin, Sherlock now believes that Van Koon and Lucas worked for the Tong. He also says he can prove it, but does not yet have proof. Back at Bart's, Sherlock flirts with Molly Hooper to convince her to bring the victims' bodies back out. As she unzips the bags, he instructs her to look at the feet, and his suspicions are confirmed with Dimmock. Both Lucas and Van Koon have the Tong tattoo on the heel of their right foot. To determine the identity of the item that was taken, Sherlock requests to have all of the books from both victims' apartments delivered to 221B Baker. There was a Sherlockism I noticed in this, which is where he says digestion slows me down, which is a very Sherlockism. How did you feel about Sherlock flirting with Molly? This was the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my entire life.
Yeah, so what I had was noting the change in his treatment of her in this versus episode 1, where in episode 1 he was pretty much oblivious to her flirting, and he never was overtly cruel When she asks him to coffee, he just interpreted it as, okay, she's going to get me coffee, and then he asks for 2 sugars. But this one, he is fully aware of the effect that he's having on her, and he uses it in a cruel manner to get what he wants. And is it the juxtaposition of those two versions of his character when it's one episode to another. It's not like this was the beginning of one season to the end of another season with all of this character growth. It was just between like the pilot and the second episode or whatever, you know?
Mm-hmm. But doesn't that suggest that that he knows he's being a dick the whole while? Then isn't that the implication of this? Because when he turns on the charm with her, it suggests that all of the behavior in the previous episode was him being a dick on purpose.
I don't think I think it was literally the writers not having that backstory fleshed out as to what the spine of the character was supposed to be, because his reactions were, to me, were like pure honest confusion as to the stuff she does. Like, you put on lipstick? Why'd you put on lipstick? Why would anyone put on lipstick? It seemed honest, and this is just, it seems like a completely different interpretation of his interaction with women.
Which is like, I think that always happens with pilots where you go and correct something from that initial representation. So like, I'm not going to knock it too hard for that, especially because, and I may be biased because I really like Molly as a character, but you know, her reaction to this is really curious, because she is a bit of a dork and kind of awkward. The fact that she finds this flirtation, like that it's successful, makes sense. Like you know, they have she has this great chemistry with him that I really enjoy throughout the kind of length of her presentation. Mm-hmm. I like how stern they are with Dimmick as well. Like, John is really mad with Dimmick, and he's like, someone just fucking died. Like, there's a seriousness to what's happening here, where it feels like our heroes are in mortal jeopardy. This is a big thing that happens in the short stories, is that, you know, the biggest challenge that Watson and Holmes have is they need to solve these crimes without getting themselves killed, and people are constantly trying to kill them. And you sense that urgency and that frustration from Watson here. And it's brilliant. Anything there before we go and talk about the books?
No. No, we talked about everything.
So Sherlock and John go over all of the books from both departments, trying to find the book that both of them own. They're sort of checking significant words that might match, that sort of thing. The essential idea is that the cipher, the first letter refers to the word on the page, and the first cipher refers to the first letter on the page, and the second cipher refers to the page number. So Dimmick returns the photo of the wall, and Sherlock explains they thought Sula and Yao would decipher them. Performing a web search on recently discovered Chinese artifacts sold at auction, which is a thing you can just Google, I guess. Sherlock finds the recent sale of 2 Ming vases that are being auctioned off by an anonymous source. We've seen these vases before. He deduces that Van Koon and Lucas each brought one of the vases back when they returned on their latest trips to China, and that it was their last delivery. Sherlock remembers noting something was tightly packed inside Van Koon's suitcase. A cross-reference between the auctions and each victim's schedule shows that the auctions always coincided with Van Koon and Lucas's trip to China. Sherlock is unable to find the proper book and tells John they should go out to get some air. John tells him he's going on a date, and Sherlock gives him a pair of circus tickets under Sherlock's name. And they'll talk about the circus in a second. So the task of... Okay, I have one note here, which is I think the task of finding the right book is sort of uniquely suited to this Sherlock and his specific skill set and magic brain palace-y stuff, where, like, I wouldn't necessarily believe that, you know, Patrick Jane and the Mentalist would have to use a trick or a ruse de guerre to work this out. He would have to trick someone into telling him. Whereas this Sherlock is like, no, I will work it out through sheer intelligence and willpower. And the mystery it proposes is a book that everyone owns, which was like a question that I thought was really interesting. I was like, oh, what is a book that everybody owns? He checks the Bible and it's not that. I'm like, oh, what could it be? It's a great little sort of side mystery that is central to this. I think this stuff is pretty cool. I like it a lot.
Yeah, the note I had was the same thing, was that this would have been an impossible task unless the person had an eidetic memory. And like the only way that you could actually do this in real life would be to pull up an Excel sheet and have two columns with all of the names of the books, and then you sort them, and then you'd have to go back and find them again and figure out, okay, these are the same books. So like Sherlock is literally the only person that could have done this right off the bat, and he actually didn't need to physically hold each book. He could have just, if all of the spines were visible, he could have just scanned each box and then done that one by one, because that's all in his brain.
Probably.
So the way that they...
Less cool visuals, though.
Yeah. I mean, the way, like you said, the way they did it, actually, this would have been a really cool spot for more of those VFX to pop up, and you could just see all the stuff going through his brain while he's looking at these titles.
I actually had that as a note, yeah.
Did you?
Yeah. Yeah, it would have been cool to see more VFX here, yeah. No, it's cool. Essentially then, so John and Sarah go to the circus, but when they arrive, they discover Sherlock is also there, and he admits he bought a third ticket. He explains to John that the Tong are using the circus as a cover to get the killer out of China, given that Chinese exit visas are hard to come by, and those who do get them need very good reasons to leave the country. And he needs John's help to look around. John is, however, in his own words, more interested in getting off with Sarah. Gross. Yuck. Sherlock sneaks off while the second act begins. A masked acrobat who flies on silk ropes. Backstage, Sherlock spots the acrobat and realizes it is Shishu. The matron comes backstage and Sherlock hides until she leaves. He finds the cans of spray paint to confirm it's the same type, and then an escape artist attacks him with a sword. The fight bursts onto stage, and John and Sarah come to Sherlock's aid. Sarah knocks him out. Sarah knocks out the acrobat. Sarah. I just can't read today. Sarah knocks him out with a stick, and Sherlock confirms he has a Tong tattoo on his foot of the same kind found on Van Koon, Lucas, and Su Lin. What do you think of this little sequence here?
I think I wrote about this like at the end because it was still so confusing as to why this globally active criminal syndicate can't get their people out of China. Like, I know it's supposedly like difficult to do, but they're a criminal syndicate. And
it's like the whole thing. Yeah.
And then tie in the fact that later on they say that there are literally thousands of people in this criminal network already in America. How did all of them get out? Like the whole...
And also, like, they're selling artifacts worth £5 million each. Surely they could just make this happen with enough money, right?
So, like, and that's the entire problem I have with Moriarty being brought in, is like they make it like they're indebted to him for helping get all these people out of the country, but the entire subplot of them needing help to get out of the country doesn't make sense in the first place. And then the circus thing, using that as their cover, still doesn't make sense, especially with the circus only being in town for one night, but the murders have been happening over the past at least 3 nights, and before that, Shiju showed up at Sulin's apartment 3 days before that, so they've been there at least a week?
Why is the circus in town for one night? Like, just have it be there for a week. It's a really easy solve. Like, also, like, I don't... is this kind of circuits that going to get you a fucking re-entry visa? I don't know. I'm not a... It's been a while since I've had to worry about visas from when I was in HR, but, like, that seems like maybe there are other ways to get re-entry visas to China if you are Chinese.
I also, in this scene, love what they did with Sarah. The fact that... I love it when women are not the damsels in distress and they'll actually go and like start fighting when fighting needs to happen. But the fact that she has no clue why her date starts beating up a circus dude, she just picks up a board and starts wailing on the circus dude. She's
immediately on board. She's like, "Yo, let's go!" I love it. I love her character. She's great. Really fun. I really like them as a trio. You can see, like, the chemistry between them all is great. John has a line where he says, "This is not a circus, this is art," and it's very funny. I think that is like top tier comedy. Like, he's like, "This isn't a circus, this is art," and he sounds so offended. It's fucking brilliant. I really like this whole sequence. I think it's really fun. It feels like a real Sherlock Holmes story where we now have the mystery resolved, which is like, well, who did it? Now we know who did it. We need to work out how to catch him. and we need to catch him without getting ourselves killed. It's the exciting bit.
It is kind of interesting that he treats her completely differently now than he does like 10 minutes from now, where he's explaining to her what's going on and he's treating her like an equal. And then fast forward 10 minutes and he's like, "Why are you still in our apartment?"
It's very confusing. It's very also, he's not dumb. He knows what's going on here. Like, he's had a conversation with John about what all is happening. He's flirted with Molly. He's not ignorant. Like, it doesn't make any sense for him to say, why is she still here? It's just inconsistent. But anyway, so the gang goes back to 221B, and Sherlock figures out the Tong will have gone back to their hideout. Sarah suggests she should go, and Sherlock agrees, but John is like, no, stay for something to eat. Sarah tries to make conversation with Sherlock with limited success, and while Mrs. Hudson brings in some food, Sarah notices that some of the ciphers are already solved. Sulin began translating 2 of the words and wrote them on the photograph they gave her. Don't know how nobody else noticed this by now. The 2 words are 9 mil, and Sherlock realizes it is the value of the stolen object, 9 million pounds. Sherlock heads to the hospital to find the book Sulin used to break the cipher, knowing this will let him break the other ciphers. Meanwhile, John and Sarah get some takeaway. The delivery man arrives quickly, and John answers the door. The man demands to know where the treasure is and then knocks John out after he says he has no idea what he's talking about. And thusly, John and Sarah are captured.
I would like to rage about this.
Which particular part? Which particular part, Darth?
Okay, so, like, if you want to briefly go over the next little bit. So Sherlock runs out the door, bumps into some German tourists, and accidentally picks up their guidebook, and then realizes, oh, wait, this is the book. And then he kind of steals their book from them, and he goes and he's interpreting.
He starts decoding.
So he's decoding everything in the book. So he was getting a cab after he ran out of their apartment. Then he bumped into the German tourists while he was 10 feet out of their apartment. Then the German tourists walk 30 feet down the road. He runs to catch up with them. He is, 30 feet away from their apartment door. He turns around while he's decoding and is facing their apartment. While he's facing their apartment, John is knocked out, carried out to a car unconscious. Then the criminal goes back in, takes the woman, knocks her out, carries her out, puts her in a car. No one on the street sees this happen. Sherlock doesn't see this happen, even though it's literally right in front of him, 30 feet away. Then the criminal goes, climbs up on the outside of the building, spray paints the cipher on the outside of the windows, climbs back down the building. Sherlock still doesn't see him, and then they drive away.
Yeah. It's almost like they should have done something with Sherlock here and had him go and do something.
Yes.
It's very weird. Or you just have, I don't know how you fix this, but like, it is incredibly unlikely the way this sequence is out.
Like, I've calmed down about this since I first wrote these notes out. I was like lividly angry at how stupid all of these just coincidences put together. And all of this happens in like a 3 to 5 minute time span while Sherlock is decoding this stuff. Like, and
this story has this problem a lot though, where it will move characters to different locations for seemingly no reason, often in like little side tangents, and then when it needs to move characters to locations, it refuses to. Like, it's weird, man.
And like
remember when they go to the library for no fucking reason? Why couldn't he have gone? He could have gone to the library here, like given them more time. Like yeah.
And then you have the problem, like even if you get rid of him, you still have Miss Hudson. Like, both John and Sarah got kidnapped and dragged out of the house without Mrs. Hudson seeing or hearing anything. Like, there are so many problems with the way that they just, like, physically choreographed this scene.
Yeah. I mean, our assumption is that it's one person. There could have been, like, 4 or 5 dudes that roll up on him. But like, just show that. Like, there's a really easy solve here, which is like it's a whole gang of them. Someone spray painting the thing, while someone else grabs Sarah. Someone else brings the car out back. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and especially because we've already seen Shiju at this point, because we see a shot of him right before he kills Su Lin, but John has not seen him. So if the dude answers the door, we see a shot of him. John thinks it's the delivery guy, but the audience is like, "Oh snap, that's the criminal." Like, that could have been a really good moment, but they don't show who's at the door because they want to keep it a secret.
Huh. I just thought about that for the first time. That is, it feels like a real missed opportunity. But I mean, these episodes do this a lot, where they're like, oh, we need to get to the climax. Sherlock gets in the cab because he's curious. John and Sarah get kidnapped when Sherlock's a block away. Like, it's like there's this panic that happens in the script where it's like, oh, shit, we forgot to get the people where they need to be. Quick, just everyone change location. Yeah, it's a real head scratcher, because you could have just not written it this way. So much to show him, like, you didn't have to do that. So John and Sarah wake up and find themselves in an abandoned tramway tunnel. The matron from the circus explains that she is Black Lotus General Shan, and mistakenly assumes that John is Sherlock. When he denies it, she points out that he has Sherlock's credit card, Sebastian's check to Sherlock, and the circus tickets in his name. She also points out that they tried to kill him 3 times and failed, but they failed deliberately so he would search for the circus. Search for the treasure. Which it's a bizarre plan, isn't it?
Yeah.
Quote, Shan points out they tried to kill him 3 times and failed, but they failed deliberately so that he would search for the treasure. End quote. What are you talking about? What plan is this? I'm going to pretend to kill Sherlock Holmes, and that will make him find this what? The fuck? Just pay him. Just hire him. Like, what do we do? Like, what are we doing? It's so confusing.
Yeah. I mean, that is a trope, that they will stage something, and frequently it's an attempted homicide, and then that will get the detective interested. So, I mean, that's definitely a trope, but why they wanted to go that confusing with it, because the murder attempt was not the crux of the mystery. I think that's probably the problem. Like, if it were, it would have made a lot more sense.
That is true. Or if the method of murder was central, right? Where it's like, the strangulation was key or something like that. So I guess I'm unclear why they needed to bait Sherlock into this. It feels like an unnecessary twist that just adds aesthetic flair, where it's like, Sherlock almost got outsmarted, but no, he didn't, because it's not him, it's John. Shan then demands to know where the Empress's hairpin is. John's like, I have legitimately no idea what you're talking about. So they set up the circus crossbow to threaten Sarah with the sandbag, intending to kill her through a failed escapology performance. In the most melodramatic scene of all time, Sherlock arrives, knocks out one of the guards, and warns her that a gunshot could easily ricochet and hit her. He kicks over a barrel to make his approach and tries to untie Sarah, but Jiju strangles him with a silk rope. John manages to knock himself over and jar the crossbow, which instead fires, and unlikely as it is, impales Jiju. Shan runs off and Sherlock frees Sarah, while John assures her their next date won't be the same. When the police arrive, Sherlock lets Dimmock take the credit, as long as Dimmock knows who he really owes for the victory. Talk to me about the sandbag crossbow setup.
Oh my word. Circus crossbow is so stupid. Did they literally drag it down here just in case they needed to torture information out of someone? And
seems to be the plan, yep.
They are ultra-rich, powerful mob bosses who kill literally anyone who crosses them, so why are they living underground instead of at a 5-star hotel?
I mean, you need somewhere quiet to do your torture, I guess, Like, you gotta get off the grid for that.
And then just the crossbow thing, like, they have a gun. What is the crossbow is such a contrived thing, and that's what I said from the beginning, that the point of this episode was to feel oriental. Like, that's why they had the crossbow there, because they wanted to keep having this theme of Chinese stuff. And killing someone with a gun or threatening her with a gun is not upholding that theme. So they had to have that there. I I mean, I like the idea that they're trying to stick to this theme. I just think it's stupid that they.
Also, they got hella guns in China, man. Like, shooting someone with a gun is the most
Yeah.
Chinese thing you can do. I think I know what's going on here. From a narrative kind of forensics perspective, I think I know why this is what happens. So the hero at the mercy of the villain is like a typical thriller convention. Think most commonly of James Bond, where the villain captures James Bond and then they explain their evil plan. Like, I expect you to die, that sort of thing.
It happens quite a lot to him, actually. Now that I think about it.
It's a staple of that genre, because what needs to happen is we need to get the hero at the mercy of the villain shows us that the hero is vulnerable and could be in mortal jeopardy, and it also gives the villain an opportunity to explain the emotional reason why they're doing this. It's a really great thriller requirement of that genre. Now, this is kind of that scene, sort of, where Shan's like, "This is why I'm bloody doing it. Let me tell you what all's going on. You're gonna give up the goods, or I'm gonna kill this woman." There's something else also happening here, which is that the crossbow moment is this thing that is already started to take root in the show, sort of, a little bit, which is Moffat tapping into this tradition in the detective and horror and thriller space, which is the idea that evil eventually defeats itself. This is really easily observed in like the American novel, and particularly in Stephen King's early works, where as long as you let evil live long enough, it will eventually defeat itself because it can't be self-sustaining. Sherlock starts to do this a little bit as time goes on, where different villains will eventually undo themselves if Sherlock and John just get through enough challenges. But it seems to me that it's sort of doing it wants both things at once, where, the crossbow is what ends up taking out Shiju, right? The evil defeats itself, but also the hero at the mercy of the villain scene. So you can see him pulling on threads of things that should work. But I mean, ultimately, I think that it comes across as a level of melodrama that I mean, to what extent this works for individual viewers, I think your mileage is going to vary. But for me, it was very close to being too much. Like very, very, like her ridiculous monologue where she's like, welcome one and all to fucking Sherlock Holmes. That was where I was like, we gotta dial it back a bit, guys. Like that was where I felt it was a bit too far. Whereas at least the apparatus itself, I thought was just I didn't mind it so much. I think the execution is where it failed.
I had a couple other just random thoughts throughout this. One was the whole thing of you're Sherlock Holmes and him saying, no, I'm not Sherlock. That whole thing hit so weird to me because in reality, the villain would not spend so much time trying to convince a person that they were that person. Like, you just wouldn't do it. It's like if you captured Bond, I'm not going to spend 10 minutes trying to convince Bond that he's Bond, because Bond knows he's Bond. Why would I try to convince Bond he's Bond? Like, this entire scene was just for the audience to show us, oh, remember all these little clues throughout the entire thing? They all meant this was going to happen. So, like, the scene doesn't really have a purpose in the story aside from the, aha, we got you, like, to the audience,
Mm-hmm.
And then something else was about John's personality, and this was another example of his personality being dead wrong compared to the first episode, because in the first one, it was a huge point that under pressure, he is strong, and he is weak when everything is happy, and he completely loses it during this entire torture thing. Like he does not act whatsoever like they established in the first episode. And the same thing is kind of true with Sarah, where in the battle at the circus she runs into the fight, but then now her personality is flipped to, she was the heroic female, now she's the damsel in distress. Maybe she had to be for this scene to play out properly, but it was just difficult to see. We liked what she did before, and now she has to be rescued while she's sitting there crying, which is the same thing that John was doing. It's like both those characters had to be diminished for Sherlock's epic introduction to, truly be worth it.
It is John settling into his key role in this entire series, though, which is being rescued by Sherlock constantly.
He's the damsel.
It at least sets that up. Yeah, he's the damsel, yes.
And then the final thing that I confirmed with two different sets of Alabamians, two different sets of rednecks, just to be sure about my gun facts being point on.
You a gun fact check? You a
Yes,
gun fact
I
check?
had to gun fact check myself to be sure because I lost it when I realized the line of dialogue. He says that is a semi-automatic. It fires at over 1,000 kilometers per hour. No, no, no. That just means how many times does the slide need to rack? That does not affect how fast the bullet travels.
That's not the bullet velocity.
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
they are not related whatsoever, but the writers think they're related. So that goes back to what I was saying, like with the cameras, like if you're gonna introduce something and have it be a key pivotal like line of dialogue, just do a little research about it. Like that's not even getting into whether the curvature of the walls would actually ricochet a bullet back to hit the shooter. I could let that one go. I'll let that slide.
No, well, because the other reading is that Sherlock is bluffing, and is wrong about his physics in this situation. Is the alternative reading there? I don't think it works either way because we've not really seen Sherlock bluff. He's always been right about stuff. But I mean, there is a potential reading there if they'd done some groundwork for him to lie about that in that moment to buy him more time.
But it's
But
also
yeah, I mean, it's
and it also doesn't mean just the semi-automatic thing doesn't mean anything once you like think about it because if all from that distance in the dark all he could see was it's a pistol. That's it. You know a pistol is not going to be fully automatic unless it's one of the really rare ones. You know it's not going to be a single chambered thing because that's only certain rifles. So yes, it's obviously just the entire line just doesn't make sense and I've got a lot of gun friends, so we ranted about this for a while.
I have a lot of gun friends. I don't know what to make of that sentence. It's very American.
Yes.
Welcome to dystopia. Okay, so the next day, Sherlock and John go to the bank. While Sherlock explains to John that Van Koon and Lucas smuggled the Ming vases, Koon stole the jade hairpin worth £9 million. John wonders how Sherlock is sure that Van Koon stole the hairpin and not Lucas, since Jiju didn't know that. As Seb hands John a check for finding the hole in their security, which is basically they need to, like, keep their windows closed, Sherlock talks to Amanda again. He reveals that she and Van Koon were having an affair. He remembers seeing an empty bottle of scented hand soap in Van Koon's bathroom, and hand soap would not be something, or hand moisturizer rather, would not be something that Van Koon would keep unless he was having a woman over. Bizarrely, Amanda admits to Sherlock that she ended the affair because Van Koon often took her for granted and they planned to go somewhere for the weekend, but he would up and leave to China on short notice. Sherlock notes that Van Koon brought her a present to make up for his abandoning and asks for the hairpin that he gave her. She hands it over and explains Van Koon claimed to have purchased it at a street market, though Sherlock explains more likely pinched it. Van Koon never knew of its real value, but only the fact that it would suit her. When he tells Amanda the value of the hairpin, she runs off in shock. So, like, it's just incredibly sexist to assume that he doesn't just, like, have this, like, hand lotion at his apartment. This is, like, an insane guess.
Especially because what was in his apartment, I'm almost positive, was soap, which was right next to the sink because you gotta wash your hands with soap.
Well, his suggestion is that the soap and the lotion have the same scent, which is proof of nothing. And that's also not, like, that's hard to do. Most brands don't do that.
Yeah, I think his...
I can't buy soap, like, the brand of soap that I buy is not the same. They don't also make hand lotion. It's a completely different industry.
Yeah, I'd say I think that we were supposed to infer that it was the label on the outside because they actually did a close-up on one of the two bottles. I think it was her hand cream that did a close-up of the label, and we're supposed to infer that Sherlock saw that same label on the hand soap that was at Van Koon's. But again, that's what I said earlier. He was 10 feet away from it. He didn't get anywhere close enough, and then the two bottles look completely different. The one in Van Koon's was a clear bottle, and then hers was like an opaque white. And I don't think that was because it was fully full of the liquid. I think it was literally just two different bottles. So unless you saw that logo brand, this entire thing just doesn't make sense.
It's bizarre and it's weird and, like, it doesn't make any sense. And, like, you could just have This is again just a bullshit guess. It's just a bullshit guess that is like kind of sexist. I don't know.
And then on top of
I just don't like
unnecessary
it.
things, like I still cannot get over the fact that Sherlock is such an unnecessary drama queen because he calls the secretary while he's in the same room as the secretary.
Oh my god, it's so unnecessary.
And no one reacts
so
to
dramatic.
it. That's the weird thing to me. Like she's not like, what are you doing? But she was like, oh, this is totally normal for you. I've met you all of one time before, you know.
Fucking bizarre. If someone did that to me, I'd be like, "What are you doing? Are you okay? What is happening? Why did you do that?"
I really want to pick up my phone and just start texting you on Signal right now. Like, hey, this is weird, right?
This is weird, right? Yes, it's weird. Weird scene, man. Weird scene. Just yeah. Anyway, it's fine. Amanda gets to keep the hairpin.
Why? Why would she get to? It's a stolen historical artifact.
I don't know, man. I don't know.
So he stole it
'cause
and
I
gave
guess
it to
they-
her. So now she has owner's rights. What?
Did they just like not tell the police? Yeah.
But they printed
anyway.
it in the paper. They printed the whole story.
We should talk about that headline, which is "Who wants to be a millionaire?"
Yeah.
Boy, isn't that just a newspaper headline? Yeah, I don't understand the logic here. Yeah. So basically, like a few days later, yeah, we get this headline, and basically Sherlock remarks that you know it's ironic that Lucas and Van Koon died because Van Koon picked up a gift with no idea of its value, despite having tried to smuggle all this expensive stuff. John correctly realizes that Sherlock is upset that General Sean got away. John does, however, point out that they've cracked the code, but Sherlock says the code can be changed. All they have to do is pick up another book. As he looks out the window, John ominously sees a Chinese street tagger writing a different cipher on another wall, which seems like a crazy coincidence. Back home, Sean talks to her benefactor M on her computer and thanks him for his help in getting them passage into London. Which, then why were we talking? What was the visa thing before? Anyway, she worries that his safety is compromised, but Emma assures her that her actions cannot be traced to him. When Sean promises that she would not betray him, the mysterious M has a sniper kill her. And that's the end of the episode. Once again, evil undoes itself, right? You know, Sean, in her pursuit of her crimes, gets herself killed. I have about 4 pages of notes about the way Moffat ends episodes, but I'm going to save it till next time just because of time.
I'm really curious about
What do you think
that,
about how this...
that cipher that we see painted? It looks like an eye that's watching Sherlock. That's painted right outside his window, and I do not understand why they put that there, unless it was a hint towards Moriarty. But it never comes up again. So it just... Unless it was coincidental and it was a street youth just doing it because they felt like it, but it looked like it was with the same exact paint as before. So it looks like it's directly a message from the criminal organization saying, hey, we are watching you. But it should not have been included because it adds more mystery and it's never explained.
It also doesn't this doesn't go anywhere. This isn't like a... It's not thematically tie into anything. It doesn't really suggest anything of significance. It just like happens and never comes up again.
Yeah.
It's weird, man. I don't get it.
So I only had one more big note, and it was kind of looking at like the overall point of this second episode, because the first episode, aside from character introductions, it was showing us this progression with John as he got over his PTSD, as he found his spot in society, he found a life worth living, and we evaluated some possible examples of growth from Sherlock as he learned to love and trust John. And all of that was in episode 1. In episode 2, at best, this shows us that John is now in charge of their finances and that the team is now officially consulting detectives who are earning a salary for their work. But that's like the best that we can get out of this episode, is that, hey, now they're making money. And at worst, this episode had no purpose at all. It didn't further any character development or any larger plot points.
Yeah. Well, and this is the thing that the show misses so often, is like the whole point of this should be like they solve a mystery and they learn something doing it. And they grow and change as people and as characters. Like that's the whole point of like fiction. Is that like you see people change from experiences they go through. At best, at very best, we learn that John can have a relationship outside of Sherlock, and that Sherlock is a bit less of a prick than he was, but that seems like a mistake of writing rather than like character growth.
Although
those are the two things, you know.
Although we could also interpret that John's relationship with Sherlock means he can never have an actual relationship, because he says to Sarah, our next date won't be like this, but there is no indication that she has anything to do with him after that, because you don't see anything and the episode ends. So at this point,
true,
that's Schrodinger's date right there. We don't really know.
Schrodinger's date. We'll find out next episode. Little sizzle for you. Yeah, interesting. I think as a second episode, this is perfectly adequate, but like you said at the start, you can really begin to identify the little misses that are going to start to pile up. I think the thing that we said, you know, toward the middle and the top was that idea that certain scenes will be referenced as if they are formally doing one thing, while the stylistics and the dialogue in them are doing something else. And you can really see how that starts to hurt the story here, where, you know, that jade hairpin scene we just talked about with Sherlock and Amanda, you know, it formally is trying to suggest something, but stylistically does something else. And I think that's going to become a real thrusting challenge with this kind of style of writing, which we'll talk a lot about when we get to next episode and the main villain of the show. In inverted commas. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Well, that's our conclusion for episode 2, which is subtitled "Do Better."
Yeah. If we had to put a subtitle on it, it's try a little harder. No, my subtitle would be write a second draft, though. Would be mine. Look, interesting. Enjoyed it. Could have been better. Okay, well, next time we're talking about episode 3 of season 1, The Great Game. This is the conclusion to season 1, so we'll cover that, and then we'll take a brief break, and then we'll be back with season 2. If you like this kind of thing, you can find everything else we do at zeroindent.com. If you want to support us and listen to whole seasons at once, so basically when the first episode of this comes out on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube, the whole of the season will be up at that point at patreon.com/zeroindent. You can also message me there and ask us questions that I'll read out at the end of each season. I've already had a few that came through from the preview I posted last week. Check us out there. If you want to check out Darth and his work, you can find him at youtube.com/Darth with a D. All kinds of great Star Wars essays. We do a series where we break down specific Star Wars scenes in a level of detail that is both traumatic for us and inexplicable, so you can go check that out. Otherwise, you can buy my book at maynardtrigg.com, and keep an eye out if you're watching this in the future for the book Give Up After 3, where you can actually read, you know, the outcome of this whole series, where I'll render it all into a non-fiction book that you can have in your home as a physical object and read through. So look forward to that. Otherwise, we'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for listening or watching, and get excited for the great game.